Hello, welcome back. Right, so first time I played, this is just a story. First time I played Disco Elysium, I turned it off after an hour because I was angry. I was angry that I'd never be able to write something that funny and clever and smart. And I was like, nah, I'm not gonna play this, frick. And I've since played it more, but I still play it like carefully because I don't want my next game to just be wannabe Disco Elysium. And right now we're so lucky that we're gonna meet the person who's responsible for me, you know, getting mad and self-conscious and stuff. Let's say welcome to Helen.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and I'd also like to thank Konsoll team for inviting me to speak here. And this is actually the very first speech or talk that I'm ever giving, so also bear with me at times. But yeah, I've kind of conjured up this lofty title, How to Build Unbelievable Worlds, based on my experience in Disco Elysium. But I'll be talking more than just building worlds today. I will essentially be giving you an overview of what I tell any writer that joins my team, like what are the first things I kind of tell them. So the talk will be a little bit about everything. I will first introduce myself, kind of tell you a little bit about where I come from and where my expertise comes from. I will also tell you then about world building, narrative design, and then later on, I will actually tell you what were the kind of dialogue structures that we used, and kind of molds that we used to write Disco Elysium. So first, a little bit about me. So as said, my name is Helen, and I'm a narrative designer. I come from Tallinn, Estonia, and I joined video games in 2016. And, well, in Tallinn, Estonia, video games are kind of that thing where you don't even know how to dream about one day working in video games. It's a little bit like working in Hollywood. It's, you know, some other people get to do it, but not me. But I was very lucky because two of my friends started a studio, and they wanted to, create RPGs. And I was asked to be a writer there. And we started out like around 20 people in the team. And out of those 20 people, only 2 people had ever worked in video games. And none of them were in the writing department. So we had no idea what we were doing, just no idea whatsoever. But a few years later, in 2019, we released Disco Elysium. And then later on, we also released its DLC, free-to-play Disco Elysium, the final cut, and I was a lead writer there. So a little bit about Disco Elysium as well, for those who are not familiar with it. So it is kind of a non-traditional RPG in the sense that it is very story-focused. And when I say very story-focused, well, it's like over 1 million words there. And, you know, some critics say that it's not a game, it's a book, which to me is a compliment. But yeah, like all dialogue, all combat happens in the dialogue. And it has 24 non-traditional skills that talk to you. What do I mean by that? Well, we took the kind of traditional RPG skills, and because we did not have like so much combat anymore, more skills are psychology-based. So there's empathy, there is Inland Empire, which is, your imagination. And this really kind of changed the entire game to become a lot more psychological and a lot more about, you know, talking to your own skills. We also had a thought cabinet, which is an inventory for ideas you might pick up in the world. So essentially, like just the same way as you would kind of, I don't know, pick up armor and then it would, change certain skills or give you some kind of design bonuses. We wanted to do the same idea with ideas and thoughts that you might encounter in your dialogues. And it takes place in the fantastic realist world of Elysium. So the world of Elysium was quite unique in a way that, actually when I started to work with the studio in 2016, most writers, and me included, and the creators of the game, we had actually already inhabited, or kind of mentally inhabited in that world that we were creating for over 10 years. Because the entire world started out as this kind of a tabletop setting that we just came up with, like together with friends. And sometimes we would play like pen and paper games in it. Other times we would write short stories, or that lead artist Alexander Rostov would kind of draw some pictures. So it was a world that we were incredibly familiar with. But 10 years, it's a lot of time. I'm not working in this world anymore, and I've realized that I don't have another 10 years to spare to come up with something so detailed. So I've slowly started to kind of ask myself questions like, okay, but what can I learn from the process of, creating the world of Elysium? And how can I now apply it to creating new worlds? And I think that's perhaps something that you're doing as well in your work. So I would say that there are two types of world building. So one of them is a universal world building, and that's what Elysium was. So when we kind of started coming up with the entire world, we didn't actually have an idea about who would be the main character, or we didn't only have one story or one location. There were multiple stories. And when we finally got to the place where we were like, okay, let's make a video game, there was a moment where we just asked, okay, but which character is going to be the main character? Because we have so many favorites. Like, how are we going to choose? And I would call that universal world building. And it's also known as a franchise or a shared universe or an expanded universe. But I think that most projects start out as a project-specific world building. So that's when you already have an idea of the main character or the main storyline that you want to tell. And then you start kind of expanding and building the world around that story that you want to tell. And then, of course, later, if you release the game or the project and it becomes very successful, you can, move on to the universal world building with spin-offs. And I think even if you are starting from that project-specific world building, you have the story that you're going to tell, the project. It is actually really good to take some tips from that universal world building, and that's what I'm kind of going to talk about now. So William J. Mitchell, who is an American media theorist, he was talking about Roland Barthes, and he said that reality, the world that we're currently in, it incorporates seemingly functionless detail because it is there to signal that it is indeed an unfiltered sample of the real. Now, what does this quote mean? It means that, if you just take a photograph of, this room, then you would have such a big level of detail. For example, like the T-shirts that all of you are wearing. Maybe some of them are vintage and have some kind of a brand name from the 80s that you don't even know what it means. But the detail is there. The name is there. And you don't even maybe stop to think, oh, hey, where does this brand name come from on my T-shirt? But fictional worlds and kind of fictional works remove a lot of that detail. And that makes sense because, we cannot just it would be insane to come up with that same level of detail. And usually it's also for aesthetic reasons that we remove a lot of detail and kind of simplify the worlds. But I would invite us to ask, how can we put this detail back in? And for that, I have this kind of a technique that I call seeing behind the corner. So, what is it that the main character of your story doesn't see? What are the locations in this fictional world that you're creating that the main character will never visit, the player won't visit? You know, what are the historical details that are not directly relevant to the story you're trying to tell? Who are the characters, you know, who don't know the main character? You'll never meet them. So asking those types of questions, it at first might see that, okay, you know, why am I asking those questions? Because, you know, I'm never going to tell those stories. I just want to focus on what's right in front of me. But the thing is that this creates a wealth of information you can later rely on in your writing. So, you know, when, for example, a concept designer comes to you and asks, hey, I've drawn this character, and they have a baseball cap on, but I don't know what's written there. Then you might already have like an answer. Oh, okay, I have this like name from, I don't know, a brand name or whatever. And you'll just feel a lot more confident when writing those dialogues because you know the world so intimately. Another way to kind of expand the world that you are creating is to import stories from our world. So for all of it, your world, you know, the project that you're spending so much time on and that is so dear to you, it doesn't actually have to be realistic. So it doesn't have to tell stories of our world, doesn't have to have humans. It can be, I don't know, aliens or some made-up creatures, not on Earth. But if you kind of start, you know, taking the stories of our world and then asking, hey, how can I tell this story with, you know, the characters that I have, with the world that I have built? What you will notice is that your world becomes a lot more detailed, a lot more realistic, a lot more believable, and you will grow as a storyteller. So for that, very good resources are Just News. For example, I yesterday learned that Elon Musk has 3 more children that no one knew about, and they just appeared. So I think now he has like over 10 kids. How would you tell a story of Elon Musk in your world? And again, it doesn't have to be that your world has humans. Maybe there is some other like creatures who are really rich, and you know, where have they come from? And other really good source is just history, Wikipedia. I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia. I spend pretty much a lot of my free time there. One of my other colleagues has a Wikipedia as their, you know, the front page of their browser. So that's really a very good technique. And one more thing that you can do is do the genre test, as I've written there. So the genre test is essentially asking, how can I tell stories that are in different genres in the world that I am building? So again, maybe you already have an idea of what the genre of your game is going to be like, but still, how would you write a romantic comedy in this world? How would you write a detective story or a spy thriller? So it might at first seem that, okay, these are just like thought exercises, you know, I'm never gonna use them, but then later on, those types of main characters, alternate main characters that arise from such like thought experiments are actually, you know, people that can become historical people in your world, or, you know, minor characters. Or you can even just put them in a newspaper somewhere so that, you know, a player just finds a newspaper and there's an interesting story in it because you know the world so well that you kind of know everything that's happening there. Next, I would like to talk a little bit about narrative design. So these are pretty much like the best design principles for coming up with skill systems and quests. So the thing about Disco Elysium is that the level of detail in that writing is, very high. That was one of the things we discovered almost immediately, that were people who just like to write a lot. And the question was then, what do we do with it? The fact that we've written so much text. But good writing does not always have to mean that all of your writing is so detailed. And a really good question to ask yourself is, okay, the game I'm building, how can actually writing support art, support other parts of the game? So one thing that I've kind of realized since then is that why Disco Elysium was able to be so detailed in its writing was because the camera was so far away. It was a top-down game. But for example, let's say that you are writing for a first-person game. The camera is much closer. You can see a lot more animations. For example, in Disco Elysium, we almost did not have an animation budget. So we did have a few, which were amazing, but we couldn't afford to animate everything. So what happened was that writing had to come in and do the rest. Writing had to describe to you, what's happening. But if the camera, for example, is so much closer, I think what happens is that, well, you can rely much more on direct speech. It becomes a little more like movie script, where, of course, you can describe, what else is happening as well. But you also have to give space for art and animation and for the level of detail that the player is already seeing, for that to shine. Second thing I've written here is about skills. So another interesting thing, I already mentioned it as well, was that in Disco Elysium you had 24 skills and they talk to you. So that means that when you were talking to a character, you would hear their speech, but then your skills would jump in and kind of comment on everything that was happening. And they almost became your companions. In fact, you actually, like out of the traditional companions, also had one, Kim Kitsuragi. But I would really kind of encourage you all to think, how can this idea be expanded? Like, how can you take this traditional idea of companions and do it a little differently? So what else could kind of come in and support, your character? Could it perhaps be like some kind of, people from the character's past who, are still there talking? Or could it be like some kind of mental faculties? I think this is also really interesting because it really ties in with the idea of tutorializing or holding the player's hand. So, I think a lot of us have this experience where, you start a new game, and then before you start it, you just check, oh, which one of my friends has already played it? And then you go to them and you're like, oh, just walk me through. Like, if you're playing an RPG, it's the question, what character should I play? Or, how do I kind of get the most out of it? Or if you don't have a friend, you will turn online. And that's all fine. But I think an interesting thing that we as narrative designers can ask, is there something in the narrative design that can be kind of that part, that friend for the player? For us, it was also skills. So skills would come in and give you hints about what you need to do next. They would kind of remind players what they were doing. Another, very familiar scenario, you start playing a game, and then you play, for a week straight, every night, and then life gets in the way. Then you come back 3 months later, and you have no idea what you were doing, right? You look at your tasks or journal system, and it is all just gibberish. You don't remember where you were supposed to go, what you were supposed to do, where the story was. So for us, it was skills that would kind of remind you that, oh, hey, actually, maybe you should be focusing on the murder case that you have to solve. And the other element was the companion, Kim-Gitsuragi. So in this Coliseum, your main character, as a main character, you play this like really over-the-top detective. And we really encourage the players to, go do the side quest. Just be as, I don't know, brave and extroverted and silly as you possibly can. Take the crazy option out of the dialogue options. And to kind of ground the player, we needed something that would be the exact opposite of the main character. And for that, we had Kim Gitsuragi. And I think this is also one of the reasons why, he's such a fan favorite. So he was always there to remind you that, hey, it's great that, I don't know, went there and solved the side case, but we actually do have a murder case to focus on. So how about we go back there? Or he would remind you what were the steps that you had already taken and what are the now the options that you can take. So he came in every now and then doing that. So ask yourself, what part of the narrative design can be that grounding part for the player? Besides just having the journal system, which is of course also a very important part of it, but also companions or skills or whatever else you might have in your game. And the fourth part here is about reactivity and the scale of reactivity. So this is the question: do the decisions that your main character makes reflect their standing in the world? So when we kind of started writing this Coliseum, and I'm sometimes seeing that in other games as well, you're kind of immediately presented with a lot of big questions. So questions about, what is the worth of a human life, or like some kind of a philosophical questions. What do you think about evil and good? And I would kind of invite all writers to ask, what are the small decisions that the players can make, the ones that can really make them connect with the main character, with the character that they are building? So I always think that like one of the things that tells the most about a person or a character is how they wake up. What is their morning ritual? They wake up. Do they have coffee immediately? Do they have coffee and start scrolling the news? That's me. Or do they do yoga, meditate? Do they maybe just like put clothes on and then dash out of the apartment and already start working? So is there something very mundane, very small that your main character can do and then the player can influence, like the morning routine, that really helps the player to connect with the character before you get to those bigger questions of what is the meaning of life, or should I kill this character, or should I save them? Should I save entire settlements? I think those questions are also very important, but it's just a question of like leading up to it. And first, just finding those small decisions that us as we are not really big world-saving heroes can relate to, and then really start connecting with the main character. And I will also tell you a little bit about dialogues and tools. So I think this part especially is very much what we would teach new writers who joined the writing team when we were doing Disco Elysium. And it's also kind of meant to demystify the entire process of writing branching dialogues. Because, you know, it might seem that, especially if you're looking at it as a player, that, okay, like how I used to like look at, I don't know, Divinity Original Sin and ask myself, like, how did they do it? But underneath, there are usually like certain molds, certain rules, certain structures that writers just keep reusing. And in Disco Elysium, we had like a very specific set of them. And yeah, I will show you a little bit of those here. But first, a little bit about tools. Because I think when you are choosing your writing tool, that can really affect the dialogue. So on the screen, you can see different things that I've heard from other writers, what they use to write dialogues. So for example, first Fallout games were all written in Word, which to me is just like insane that they were able to achieve so much in just Word and Excel. But I would roughly say that all tools are in two different categories. So there are the tools that show you visually the trees of branching dialogues. And then there are tools where you cannot visually see the kind of narrative programming and the dialogue options branching into different answers that the character gives you. And I would very much encourage everyone to use visual tools. So a lot of them are kind of free to use if you're just starting out, like Artist Draft or Twine. But even if for some reason you don't have access to those and you are using Excel or Word, just use like Whiteboard or Miro to kind of draw out the dialogue structure. Or if you have your own tool that the company is using, then just, I guess, hopefully it is also a visual tool. But if it's not a visual tool, then also you cannot expect yourself to have as much reactivity as maybe Disco Elysium had, because we honestly could have not done it without seeing visually what the dialogues looked like. So what I mean by visually seeing what the dialogues looked like. One moment, I will show you immediately. Yes, so this is an example of a branching dialogue. And I will come back to it in a moment. I will show the kind of things and tricks that we used. But first, I will also give a few more just tips about writing dialogues generally. So, as I mentioned earlier, in 2016, it was a team of like 4 or 5 writers in Zaun when we were working on Disco Elysium. And we had like no game dev related education, nothing. So we just, started writing. And what we discovered is that, well, when we would then play each other's dialogues, we would almost kind of get this a sense of claustrophobia, because we couldn't really understand where in the dialogue we are. What's happening? What's going on? How do I exit this dialogue? Like, we even have this one moment in Disco Elysium where we make fun of this kind of a claustrophobia, where you have this one dialogue option that just keeps repeating itself for like 10 times, and the main character is like, why am I repeating this one sentence? Like, what is happening to me? Am I having a heart attack? But all of this was to kind of reflect the, our growing as writers. So one of the first things we learned was that it is very important to create a sense of security for the player. So this means that they understand where they are in the dialogue. So are they in the main hub? Where can they exit the dialogue? Where do new questions show up? And another thing we learned was that you really have to communicate where certain dialogue options lead. So I think the best way to kind of get around with it is just to have a lot of people play your dialogue, we had this habit that, in the writing room, we would all play each other's dialogues, and we would say that, oh, wait, I thought that this dialogue option leads somewhere else. I thought it means something completely else. So we would just really communicate with each other. Or if you're one of those people who's just like the lone writer of the team, when others are playing, testing the game, just ask them this question. Oh, was there ever a moment where you thought, actually my character is going to say something else or mean something else, and then there was a surprise moment? So yeah, that was the first thing we learned. The other thing was about rewarding the player. So again, we just discovered that when we were writing, a lot of our characters had a lot of backstory. They grew into this enormous dialogues. And one way we did to kind of make it not so overwhelming for the player was that we would hide the really long dialogue branches or the long backstory that the character is telling about themselves. And we would kind of hide them behind either skill checks or, one of the kind of sayings that we had was always get the player out of the dialogue. And that was that, make sure that they just get a quest, for example, they go, they have to do something, and then when they come back, you can finally ask about, where this character comes from, or what were they, telling about their mother earlier. So this is the way that don't just dump all of the information right there. Make sure that the players have something they can come back to. And the third is mix it up. So one of my colleagues, I remember, said that writing dialogue options, it's a little bit like composing a song. So you have to get a certain rhythm going. And we also at first experimented with always having 3 options, and then one of them is like a good cup, one is like neutral cup, and the other is like really bad cup. But what we realized is that it doesn't really engage the player if they always know, there are always going to be 3 dialogue options, and then you always know that if you just press one, you will get good cup points. So we started to really mix it up. Sometimes you have questions, sometimes you have statements, you have 2 dialogue options, you have 4 dialogue options. So that way the player is engaged because they don't know what's coming. And here you can see one of the example dialogues in Disco Elysium. So this is made in RDC Draft 3. So most of our dialogues would follow this really simple structure. There would first be a greeting that establishes the character. So this is the thing that the players only get when they first meet the character. And then they would get to the main hub, and the main hub is where new questions would show up. And it's a very standard structure. A lot of games use it. We also figured that it's easier for us, to do the kind of flag programming when we also only have 2 places where the player can exit the dialogue. So the first one is when you just click on the character, and then you're like, oh, okay, that's an interesting character, but don't really want to talk to them right now. So you can leave early in the greeting. And the other very standard place is in the main hub. So once you ask a question, you come back to the main hub, and then you can leave. So here you can see the greeting a little bit more. And I think an interesting thing here is I would really invite you to think about the character name. So the character name, it doesn't just tell you information about the character. It also tells you information about the main character and the assumptions they might make about this person. So yeah, just be creative. In Disco Elysium, we didn't always just have the character's name. Sometimes we had a short description. I think you could even take it even farther and have character names that change as you get to know this person a lot more. So yeah, be creative. And the other thing you can see is just an example of a passive skill check. So a passive skill check is pretty much what we meant by, hey, your skills are talking to you. So what happens in this dialogue is that you meet this girl in an orange parka. They're kind of shy, and then empathy comes in and says that, yeah, they're really nervous. Like, you know, maybe you should kind of make them feel at ease a little bit more. And then you have this new you option, which is like, no need to be shy, I don't bite. Like, can you, what's on your, yeah, what do you want to, like, but in a kind of friendlier way. And it leads to a different outcome. So I just wanted to kind of visually show what we meant that skills talk to you. And then in Main Hub, we discovered that usually we had 4 different types of branches or questions. And of course, like, you could have like a different number of those, like all dialogues don't have those. But generally, we would have something that we started calling a river. Now, river is something that moves the story forward. And this is the first option that you see there. I will come back to it in a moment. You would also have a hub, which is a way to group questions that are similar. So a very classic example is, hey, where are you from? And then the character tells you where they're from. And you have like a lot more questions, and you can later return to it. The third is a white check, which was a type of a skill check. I will talk about it later. And then leave option. So when you're writing a river, which leads the story forward, one thing we noticed was that if you mix questions and statements in dialogue options, what I mean by it, one of them is like a question, like, hey, you know, where do you come from? And the other 3 are statements. Oh, I think that you are too, I don't know, aggressive, or I think you're too friendly. That what players would do is that they would almost always go with the question. Because I think we humans were really undecisive. We don't want to, you know, we always want to learn more information. So if you want to make sure that your players really are kind of building their character by making statements, then don't mix them don't mix questions with statements. And another thing was that the dialogue options almost became for us as thoughts inside the main character's head. So what do I mean by that? So essentially, it wasn't just that, you know, the main character agrees with all of the different conflicting statements. No. Rather, what I mean is that, you know, when you think, for example, about a political issue, and you already know where you stand, then quite often, when you are thinking about them, you have thoughts that you have learned or ideas that you've learned from society come into your mind. And there is always this like moment where you can be like, oh, hey, maybe today I am changing my mind on this topic. So we always wanted to kind of create the U options so that it would almost be like those different ideas a little bit talking to each other. So they would also have a little bit of a conversation going on. Another kind of structure that we started using was a whirlpool. So a whirlpool was our way of communicating to the player that, oh, hey, if you have like a quick question, but it's not really a moment where you cannot pick the second option, then we started writing this wait, what type of thing. So what is happening here on the screen is that the character tells you that their name is Eliška. And Encyclopedia comes in and says, oh, it's a Czech name, but weird, she doesn't have any accent. So there are now 2 dialogue options. One is, wait, isn't that a Czech name? And the other is, so Eliška, you're a game developer. And we wanted to communicate to the player that, hey, just because you're picking the first one doesn't mean that you cannot pick the second option. So whenever there was the kind of a whirlpool structure that would lead back to the second option, we just started using wait. And of course, you can use like a different structure, but the main thing is that intuitively, once the players have played enough, a lot of them will start understanding it. They will start understanding that, oh, it's just an additional thing that I can ask. I remember I watched a stream of a player playing Disco Elysium, and there was another one commenting that stream. And I remember they were saying that, oh, wait, they're so in the beginning that they haven't really discovered that weight structure, or they haven't really discovered the kind of hidden rules that we have. But even in the end, it does become quite intuitive for the player. Here you see an example of a rate check. So rate check for us was a question, how can we design a skill check where the failure doesn't just keep the door shut or the gate shut and just the player is like, oh, I didn't get the content, I'm just going to load and see what happens. We wanted to create a skill check where the failure is as interesting as succeeding. You do something that really you embarrass yourself, for example, or something else like that, and it becomes part of your character. So this was kind of our way of doing it. We designed a rate check. This is just an example of a hub. Talked about it a little bit earlier. So a way to group together questions about one specific topic. And here we see a white check. So a white check was a different type of skill check. And this was like more traditional in a sense that, you have test your, for example, empathy skill. And if you fail it, nothing happens. You can try it later. You can go to the world, you can talk to people, maybe become a little bit more empathetic person. Or maybe you learn more about this person somehow, and these are the things that unlock the skill, and you can try it on later, and then hopefully succeed. And yeah, that was essentially the kind of 4 structures, or like the structures that we used in Disco Elysium to build our dialogues. I think that especially as this, I believe this talk is kind of recorded, you can later really come back to this, maybe study the slides a little bit more in detail. And I think every good dialogue needs this really basic, strong structure that you can rely on. But for the ending, I think I would just like to leave you with this one very, very long quote from Rainer Maria Rilke. And it talks about frustration and patience. And I think it's so important as creative people to just learn to be very patient. Like, I still very much get frustrated with my writing. And the artists I know, or the designers I know, they get frustrated with the work they're doing. So the main thing is just, learn to be patient. It will come. Producers, of course, will say that no time to be patient, actually. but yeah, just be kind to yourself, and you will do great work. So thank you. Yeah. And yeah, I think we have some time for questions. So if anyone has any questions they want to ask me, then raise your hand. Yeah, you there.
Yes, I'm in the middle of my first playthrough of Disco Elysium, and I'm in love with the game completely. But one of the things that I wanted to ask about is you have 2 NPCs that you meet kind of back to back that are racist characters. And one of the body types is a guy that is clearly very embittered about his life. He's dirty, he doesn't take care of himself. And then the next character is this peak genetic, beautifully built person that subscribes to the features of his race. And so I'm wondering, how exactly do you guys structure 2 NPCs back to back like that to make sure that you can attack a single issue? And how far apart should those be? Would it be more more pertinent to have them side by side so that you don't get skipped to the issue, or should you break that narrative up to where you get a different lesson or perspective on a topic like racism later in the game?
Yeah. So the question was about two characters in Disco Elysium, two racists. So you meet them really early on in the game, and one of them is like, you know, pretty much like an alcoholic and kind of really down and to his life. And the other one is this really proud one, who, you know, looks muscular, and you later have to kind of maybe fight this character. And the question was, you know, was it intentional that we put them so close together to kind of tackle this one issue of racism? And yeah, like should perhaps they have been like more spaced out or something like that? So I will say that, so a lot of people say that, you know, Disco Elysium is a game that, you know, tackles politics, and I very much encourage everyone to deal with difficult topics, but also be prepared that, you know, working on those topics takes a lot of time. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like this was part of the game that we were like the most worried that, are we gonna get it right? There were so many edits. There was exactly the question of, oh wait, if you just start playing the game and this is like what happens, will you get like a wrong impression? Will it just be like, oh, I don't want to play it, like there's a racist character just here in the beginning, and I don't want to play it. So we really kind of thought about the issue, and yes, that was one of our actually ways to just put the two different examples of racism very close to each other. And we would also add more characters before it. So when we first started building the game, the cafeteria where you're in, that was much more empty. You would just come out and you would see those characters. So we just put a lot more previous characters who would kind of maybe even, you know, talk a little bit about it. But I will say that it was a difficult part for us, and I don't really have very easy answers because it really depends on your game, but just be expected that very understandably you just can't write that in a passing if you're dealing with politics or racism. Expect that it will take more time, and expect that this is the part that you really want like a very diverse friends of yours, like all of them to read through and say, how do they understand it? So yeah, I hope that answers a little bit of your question. Any other questions?
Yeah, so
Yes.
I had a question about, because when I make games, I often have the gameplay and then the game stops and then there's a cutscene and then the game continues. And I feel like that can be a little bit annoying. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on incorporating narrative into actual gameplay?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the reasons why we wanted to do combat in dialogues. So, well, there were two reasons. One was like this very prosaic reason of we didn't really have people who would do combat design and we didn't have budget for it. But then we also started asking like, oh, hey, how can we do combat, for example, in riding? Like, because these are quite often like the really big parts, you know, especially, for example, if your main character actually shoots at someone. Our character, for example, is a police detective. You know, this is something that you want to really narrate and talk about. And our idea was to do it in writing. And the other thing, as you mentioned with cutscenes, is that we don't, in Disco Elysium, really have parts where you're not in control of your character. So we always wanted the player to have an option where they can say something or decide something. And it was exactly because of that it kind of creates this sometimes like this, so wow, now I'm not controlling my character. But I do think that, a lot of people also say that, Disco Elysium is a very heavy game, in a sense that, there's just a lot of information coming at you. So I think for my future projects, I would probably actually like to incorporate a little more cutscenes, because it can also be something that gives the players a little bit of rest, like, oh, okay. So I really encourage everyone to use cutscenes. So just think of it as something like a pressure and a release, like they can just, not read a little bit so much or see some beautiful art, things like that. Thank you.
Hey,
Yeah.
Amazing talk. I have so many questions, but I'm going to do one. I'm curious, when you're doing a narrative, which is so many branches and stuff, I imagine that you maybe want to start with a baseline of the narrative. And I'm curious, at what point do you find it more natural to bring in the player choices, and when do you delve into that?
Yeah. So I think there are two layers to it. So one thing is that if you're like designing a settlement, we would kind of have an idea of what the main story is and what the main story parts are. But actually, before we got to like actual writing, we left a lot of room for like any side quests that just might pop up when you're writing. And I think this is also what makes Disco Elysium so eclectic, because quite often, like those side quests were something that we would just procrastinate on. You don't want to do your work, and you go online. And I remember I, at some point, was really into parrots for some reason. So there is like a tiny part of the game which is about parrots. And I think if you just leave that room, if you're already like, okay, this is like talked through with producers, it's in production, that, we haven't designed everything in the game, that there is like this tiny part that can just come up when you're writing, then yeah, that's gonna make the game a little bit more alive. But talk with producers, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
When it comes to world building and gameplay, did you have the gameplay before you started the world building? And would you prefer having that? Or could you just start doing world building before you figure out the gameplay?
Yeah, so Disco Elysium specifically started with world building first. We just knew that we wanted to tell a story, and our approach to game design was more like, okay, what tools in game design, and it was like really inspired by D&D. What tools can we use to tell the story? So for example, how can we design skills so that they really fit our story that we want to tell, which is like a lot more psychological and a lot more about your, the kind of, the mental disorders or illnesses that you might have, or the kind of really strong emotions, like how can we use skills to tell that story? So for us, yeah, it was world building first. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, really insightful talk, thank you. So when I played Disco Elysium, which is one of the best games I've ever played, I played it with a friend of mine from Latvia, and I've also spoken to friends from Lithuania, and it's clear that to them the game is very special for different reasons than for me, because to them it feels like it feels like home in a sort of way. Like it's a fantasy world, but it's very, very familiar to them. And I was sort of wondering if during the writing process for the game, or the many years you spent coming up with this world, if that was a deliberate choice to sort of take your Baltic or your Eastern European or post-Soviet culture and sort of incorporate it into this world was deliberate, or if that was more just a natural outcome of your backgrounds as writers.
Yeah, so it's always the interesting thing where, so I have like some, musicians that I really like. And to me, it seems that I don't understand where their kind of musical language comes from. But then I remember one of them like released a mix of their like favorite songs, and then I was immediately like, oh, that's where it comes from. So quite often like what is original is actually that you don't really see what are the inspirations there. So if you ever visit Tallinn, Estonia, you will probably feel like you're in Russia. It's very similar. And I think it was just that, it's quite very difficult to avoid the influences you have in your life and where you grow up, because this is where we took all of the stories and took the characters, and it was the kind of post-Soviet Estonia. A lot of characters like Evert are inspired by some Estonian politicians, but I also just really encourage everyone to like look around. You might think that, I don't know, maybe I grew up in a small town, there's nothing interesting here, but there almost always is. And it's your way of kind of, how do you take those influences around you, what you see, and translate them into art? So, yeah.
Thank you. Hello.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I've got two very close questions that can be answered shortly. It's first, how do you prepare for player agency when it comes to dialogue choices? And also, how do you make sure that players are satisfied with negative reactions to their choices? To elaborate, like, as people in general, we don't like being assholes, thankfully.
Yes.
So if players get like a negative reaction, especially from my personal experience in Baldur's Gate 3, I try so hard not to save scum my way through the game, which can also be done in Disco Elysium too. How do you sort of convince people to continue with their negative reactions, the negative consequences, instead of preventing saves coming? And how do you narrate them, guide them towards making the bad choices, or finding joy, finding the story behind the bad choices?
Yeah, really, really good question. So I would say that there are two ways you can make like negative decisions in a game. So one is like if you, as a player, you click on the dialogue option that is very clearly written out as something negative, and then you know what you're going to get in. But the other thing, and I think that's what you were kind of referring to, is if you fail a skill check. And there are many examples in Disco Elysium where something absolutely horrible happens. You say something very, very, I don't know, like offensive maybe to someone, or you just completely embarrass yourself. And I think one way to do it is that, this bad thing happens, but you maybe give players ways to react to it. So there are dialogue options that really kind of, are part of their sheer horror when they're seeing what just happened, or it almost like they can reflect on what happened there with some other character. And I think that actually that's something, when I think back to Disco Elysium, I think we could have done it a lot more, given you ways to reflect back on some like negative red check failures. But I would say that, just maybe the companion comes in to talk, or there are dialogue options that are already like, oh my God, I don't know, I just completely ruined my talk. Like, how do I feel about it? Or you talk with a friend. So yeah, but thank you. Yeah, and that was the last question as well. I think my time is up. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be here if someone else wants to talk. Thanks.
So great. That was great. Amazing. Yes. I hope you're ready to learn even more about world building from my good friend Peter at Rain Games, who is up next. Woo! Peter!
So, hello everybody. This is one of the last talks on the last day, and are you all still awake? Woo! Excellent. Now, actually, I found it very useful that this talk was before me, because it's more or less like the opposite half of doing this kind of world-building stuff. This is very sort of a technical walkthrough of how they did stuff. like their game has more than 1 million words in it, and this one has 0. Just a bit of a difference. What I would like to say, though, is that I really, and I'm going to show that a little bit here as well, I really want to emphasize like the fact that we take stuff from some place that is not our own medium is important. Other mediums are fair game, of course, but also like actually going out into the world physically and then grabbing things that are there and then bringing them back to video games is like a really great thing to do. And I can be really recommended because, you know, if your only inspirations are the video games, then people will get a sense that they've played the video game before because, in a sense, they have. So, for this one, for Tesla-grad 2, we had the problem, of course, that it is a sequel. And I know that some of you have played Tesla-grad 1, but most of you haven't. So I will show you a little bit of what that game looked like first. But to just briefly say a little bit of what we put into the cooking pot for the original Tesla-grad, we had our own sort of alternative science history. So it's a little bit of steampunk, but like, you know, we were not super fan of just gluing cogwheels and stuff, so it's a little bit more sort of its own style of older tech. We wanted to imagine a world where there were 4 great nations. They had each advanced technology in a different way than we did in reality, and differently from each other. And Tesla-grad was a great city in a nation of Electropia that based everything around electricity. They didn't have any sense of sort of chemistry or mass production, but in electricity they could do anything we can do, and more. So their science is essentially fantastic at that point. And for that game, we based a lot of it on sort of what we knew of, and took a lot of, with the name itself as well, took a lot of Eastern European inspiration and put it sort of in a version. It was always meant to be a mix of like Scandinavian influences and Russian influences. Like the capital in the original game was like a mix of Bergen that you're in now and Moscow. We just replaced the snow with rain. The guards, instead of having a uniform that makes sense for snow, they have a uniform that makes sense for rain. And so, yeah. But I'm not going to go too deeply into that. I'm just going to show it to you a little bit, at least. My clicker works. Good. So, hopefully, that gives you sort of a sense of the original. So that was what we had. And with the new game, it went a little while after we did this one until we decided to do the sequel. Actually, like, the Tesla-grad 2 ended up coming out about 10 years after Tesla-grad 1 came out. When we had finished the original game, we had used every good idea we had. The only thing we had left was like our bad ideas. I'm just going to go to the next slide, even though I'll get to it a little later. So but when we returned to it, we were really happy to do so. We had accumulated tons of ideas over the years. We were basically the fans of our own game, essentially. And so we definitely wanted to make a new one. But we also knew we didn't want to stick too close. Like, there were some things that we definitely needed to bring forward, like this world, the technology in it. But we knew we had to change like a large portion of it as well to make it like fresh and new. And so with the exploration then of this city in the first one, we wanted to move it to another part of our world. We had named it Wormheim, and we wanted to make it a lot more based on sort of the world and the place that we have around us. And with that, and with this area of the world, we wanted to make like a story in that kind of world that was very inspired by like Norwegian landscape and history. And of course, that meant road trip. For those that have driven around in this country, it's sort of a familiar image. Like if you, for practical purposes, sometimes you have to drive to Oslo, and rest stops along the way, they look like this. It's like both sort of very mundane and very amazing at the same time. You have like a gas station, that's the most mundane thing in the universe, and then you have like nature that just looks like it's completely unchanged through history and has ignored humanity entirely. And that is like what we went out to see. Now, when you live here, you don't normally act like a tourist. So we don't run out and look at this stuff all the time. And there, a gang from the office assembled for the trip. This is Oliver Rudio does our art, Petter does tech art, me, of course, and Thomas is one of our programmers. And also, like, I had to look through the image on the trip, and there was none of him because he was holding the camera. However, caught him. And yeah, this is just a single day trip for us in sort of the terrain around here. For you, those that haven't, like, if you ever, like, those of you that are international, if you get to Konsoll any other time and you just book an extra day and have a look at this area, because it's amazing. So, one thing that's a big feature of the landscape area is like water. This is like an extremely wet area. It's the rainiest city in Europe, and you notice it. Like water is absolutely everywhere. So we knew we wanted to integrate that, and not only like as a terrain piece, but also like be able to interact with it. However, I still firmly hold that swimming is the worst part of any game that includes it, because everything slows down and it's like a bit bad. So considering that, like how do we do waterfalls properly? We want to make them mechanic to be able to then, because we're like a person using electricity. Like, how does electricity act through water? Yeah, you just conduct through it. So you just dematerialize and like blink or instantaneously move through water. Actually, we forced the player to swim a bit for like 5 minutes before we give this ability to just increase appreciation. But like this as well is something we wanted to watch because nature in these places is interrupted all the time by practicality, right? This again is like this kind of nature just meeting the very mundane. We need, like someone in Norway needed electricity, and so they put a telephone pole here, and that's like there's something going on here. You have the technology and like technological world meeting the natural world. And you might say like, oh, you shouldn't put a telephone pole in a place like that. Well, then we cannot have telephone poles in Western Norway because it's all like that up there. So it had to go somewhere, as they say. And like this terrain, man, it invokes ideas of monstrous things. How did that get there? And the true reason is that it was carried by a glacier back in the day, but it looks like a giant just tossed it. And like, again, this is not a specific tourist attraction. This is just across the road randomly because they're all over. And sort of bringing that to the world. And again, like when you look up on the mountains, you can see you dwarf and you get all these like rivers and waterfalls. And like this terrain looks very sort of untraversable, and it is. But just imagine like if you were able to travel up a waterfall like lightning, how cool wouldn't that be? Waterfalls approved. Now, again, a lot of what we looked at as well was like getting like the meeting of nature and science. And there's something like brutalist about the whole thing. Like if you've ever seen like Lord of the Rings, which most of you probably have, Isengard is that. Like you have this beautiful forest and there's a building that looks like an iron nails just smashed into the middle of it. And just looking at that, it just tells a little bit of story. And this looked like a small dam I found because of the bolts, but that's us standing on the edge of it. So it's like, I mean, it's not a huge dam, but it's like has some size. When you look down at the thing, has some dimensions. And a lot of this stuff just carved into the landscape there. Again, for all of the practical purposes. And like, the verticality of this area is insane. you stay on the road, but you can't leave the road because you have to deal with this stuff. So there are areas, of course, where you can wander, but you also have like this. And again, just humanity just forcing its way through it all the time. Like all the natural things gave way to some hard, brutalist angles and this kind of thing. And I haven't ever seen this in a game, like this juxtaposition. Like it's all around us here, so I was very sort of used to it. And I wanted to include it in our world. They also look like little buildings like this. This is in the middle of an area where they show up, and I'll show you some of that as well, but like show off some, there's a Viking ship and there's some more like Viking-like buildings, and then they need to make an information building. And they wanted it to mesh with the terrain, and they built this, which is like a strange thing. Like it has a lot of very modern parts of it, but it has a grass roof, and it's low ceiling, and they've tried to do things with the concrete. And this is the area that's in. You see sort of on, you see two eras there actually of sort of Norwegian history. You have the houses here on the one side that are built in the old style of some of them of the Viking Age, some of them of different eras. Like it's not all too time accurate over there. And then you have these white houses that you find a lot of. These are considered very traditional today, that people still actually build them. But they are more sort of rooted in sort of a romanticism, romantic era in Norway. And that both those eras existed in this insane landscape. Yeah, and again, when you look at this stuff, right, you feel that something large has to be inhabiting this place, because it feels like nothing small scale fits in. Like the ideas that we've always had locally about like trolls and giants and Jotuns come from people who look at this and go like, well, clearly this was not made for people, so what's it for? Like again, you see the house that doesn't fit in here, it's like scale problem. And again, what lives here? This is just imposing and sort of dangerous looking. And yeah, Norwegian stave churches, the most fantasy thing I've never seen in fantasy. We had to put this in the game, like totally. Like the architecture of this, like if you don't know, the Vikings became Christians at some point, and they were very sort of, yeah, this new religion is awesome. We like this new guy Jesus. He managed to defeat death, making him really strong. We don't really trust him to keep a house by himself. Let's put some dragons on it to keep the evil spirits away on top there. That's what we usually do. Crosses, of course, that's the new style. And let's build it out of wood, because that's how we do it. We build boats, not things that will cut rock. And so the cut rock here, as you see at the bottom, that's added later. These things are just fantastic. Like, just the smell of them as well. If you're wondering why they're black, by the way, like these things are hundreds, almost thousands of years old, but like hundreds of years old. And they use tar to make sure that the wood doesn't rot, because what wood stands up for like that long? But the tar is black, and it creates this smell. It has a distinct smell of an Islay whiskey when you approach this thing. It's like, if you ever seen like an old ship, like not a modern, but an old pirate ship, if you ever been in a museum or seen like anything from that era, they tarred everything, and then you get this blackened look on everything. And inside the thing as well, I have to be a little aware of my time, I think. The carvings. I mean, I know a lot of you guys have seen similar things on like the arm of a biker or something, but it's actually like historical artifacts as well. These things, when they originally made them, they tell stories, by the way. If you look at them for a little while, we have the arch itself is just a normal carving, but in the side here, you see beasts fighting each other and biting each other. And sort of all kinds of histories that are told. And in the old stave churches, you find a lot of stuff that definitely shouldn't be there, because there's a lot of references to pagan stories as well. Of course there is. Like you see the Fenris wolf on occasion and stuff like that. This ark is in that church. This is a part of it as well. Like we wanted to get this in and sort of imagine what the people that built this building would do when they built other things. The stave churches survived from this time because they were revered buildings, right? But they were built in the style that they built other things in the era. So if they built like a great hall or a large building, they would use this style, but most of those buildings are gone today. But we still have a couple of these churches left. And like, yeah, I mean, all churches have gargoyles, but like these gargoyles are sure cool. This is not a trip. All those other pictures were from our trip. This is not. I had to sneak this in here because we would have gone here, but like the ferry had a bad timing as well. It's a different stave church. If you look at this, it's a little suspect. Like there's a Fenris wolf there. What's it doing on a Christian church? But you know, the guy had a project before. This is his new project, and he had some ideas, and he brought them along like we do. So this is basically how they are constructed, right? This is the idea of timber. And like this is funny as well, like you see this especially in larger churches, there's a slight arching to all the flat surfaces because they learned from the boats that a straight beam doesn't hold, like a slightly arched one holds better. And yeah, today, their great-great-great-grandchildren build like this kind of stuff. Everyone in Norway, this is a very sort of well-known sort of imagery, like the Norwegian oil platforms are. Like, I know they're actually a little bit unique. Oil is really deep, and this stands like there. You can't see land from this place. And it's a huge building for that reason, because everything has to sort of live on there, so like a little mini city. Of course, oil is far out and deep down. But what if, let's imagine, they had to get that oil up a little earlier and still were sort of had the traditions of oil, of all sort of how they build it. The little detail actually I forgot to put attention to. You see, let's see, I have a pointer as well. You see those things, what they are? They're boats, drop boats. Here's one as well. The reason you have those is that on oil platforms, potentially something can happen. And if you get a fire on one of these things, you want to leave. Because, yeah, that can go horribly poorly really quickly. So, like, we have a good safety history, but just as part of that safety history, we have these drop boats. But of course, in this tradition, that leads to drop Viking ships, right? So of course, and again, like they get oil from they need it to run their raiding ships, which are airships in this setting. They use boats, of course, as you see here, but for practical purposes, an inland raiding, and a self-respecting Viking uses an airship. And so, of course, like a wooden platform is not probably the safest construction in the world. But like, again, we wanted to take sort of that style, because you see the items and artifacts as well. This is a Viking artifact carved out of bone. You see some of the same sort of carving ideas and patterns on it as you see on the stave church itself. It was like, and of course, if any one of you is sort of thinking, oh, Celtic knots and stuff like that, yeah, they're close by geographically and probably influenced each other at some point. I mean, the Viking visited everybody. And sort of, yeah, like, this is a more sort of common house for, like, if you're just going to put up a shack where you're going to dry your meat, you can build this. But it's also, like, important. Every building can't be, like, a grand, awesome tower. And, of course, at some point, this is an old wood carving, by the way, originally. At some point, Norway was Christianed, and you get, like, the removal from the era of, like, the Nordic tales and these things. And over time, it shifts into what Norway considers its romantic period. It's like we have two complete mythologies to draw from. Because the romantic era mythology is like a whole set of different sort of creatures, of special nature spirits. It's like you get rid of the gods and all those grandiose things. And then there are little things like living in your well and whispering to you in the forest and luring you away. And like in a different sort of style. As I mentioned, the two sort of house styles. And this is a painter, again, that most people in Norway know, but I know it's not well known outside of Norway. Well, not to everyone at least. Kittelsen, this man captured the feel of that sort of romantic era and the monsters from it like really, really well. He has some awesome drawings. I must remind you, this is not like new. Because it is important to just point out, because some of the stuff he shows seems much more modern, because it seems based, oh, it's played World of Warcraft or something like that. he depicted trolls, as they were foretold. This is a creature as well. This is Nøkken. It lives in the in lakes and can pull you on the water. And since you wouldn't trust this thing, it can shapeshift, so you don't have to. Maybe you'd like, there's a horse, it's free horse just riding around, but Nøkken can shapeshift into this thing and then it takes you under. I'm sure, like again, historically, mythologically, I'm sure actually there are some resemblances to Kelpies in there. And by the way, like this is typical in Norwegian nature as well. If you ever travel out, you'll totally see these supernatural creatures all the time because there's so many things in nature that just look like monsters. And he actually throws that in as well. Like in this area, are these things meant to be monstrous? Or are they just interesting tufts of grass? So we create our own sort of versions of it in the sense of these creatures that we have throughout the game, some of which you interact with and some may remain more sort of mystical. But yeah, the Norwegian trolls differ from most of the depictions you see in other places, mostly by the fact that we consider them to be large. You saw where they have to live, right? They're not small, and they could probably throw that rock. And so, this is not a troll, this is Draugen. This is a drowned sailor, essentially, an undead. They return as well in order to, they hate the living, and especially those they loved in life, and they want to drag them down to the deep with them. Draug is an interesting creature. You probably heard like Skyrim and stuff that spread that idea around the world. But they are sort of the Nordic or the Viking undead. They were specific, in this era, they're very sort of connected with sailors. And that has to do with, well, worst things have happened at sea as they sail, or the sailors didn't make it. But any undead in the Viking mythology would be considered a Draug. If you disturb the ancient burial mounds and hills, then you might meet a Draug who does not agree with you. And these are scary undead as well, because most of the sort of buried Draug are warriors, and they would be as fearsome in death as they were in life, with the exception that they could no longer be killed. And so again, 100-something-year-old portrait that looks like it's inspired by Lord of the Rings, but is older than the Lord of the Rings, or indeed any treasure-finding game de jure. It's all from these areas as well, but again, as I mentioned before, we want to take the original inspiration and perhaps they're a little bit away from the more typical tropes. This as well, this is Soria Moria. This is a castle in also Kittelsen drawing, a castle in the mountains east of the sun and west of the moon is the location if you were ever wanting to find it. And so this is also like clearly inspired by like those huge mountains and like something living in them or them being constructed and being like a thing unto themselves. And again, sort of the lure and the danger of things in nature. This is Kvitebjørn, Kong Solomon, and he is a creature who's bound to Soria Moria as well, with the princess riding upon him. And again, trolls. Like part of the idea of them is that they're such a part of nature that they're meld with it completely. This is a Kittelsen drawing as well. And them just being like basically a mountain. So truly enormous. This man does not notice the trees growing upon him. The reason the great hills are so large that they are essentially sleeping giants, right? And so we wanted to incorporate this kind of troll into our world. This is us again doing concept for Tesla-grad 2. And then having like the more modern person with their electricity exploring this strange and dangerous place. And trolls as well. Like we wanted to make all the they're not supernatural in our universe. It's a science fantasy. But we wanted to make them sort of steam related. In the local stories, there are like the underjordiske, the subterraneans. It's a little strange because they're not all subterranean, but like the Fey folk, I guess, is this weird translation, but I guess might fit. They all sort of are related in a sense, and we wanted to make them like visually connected and also like historically connected. They come from a single source of origin. And so we take a lot of, because we had creatures already, I'll show one later in Tesla-grad 1, that we have called Grus. And these creatures have a distinct look about them. And then we created all these other varieties to keep some of that Gru look, especially the eyes, around, to show that they share some sort of origin outside of humanity. This, one of the bosses in the game. Again, some of the larger creatures in all these mythologies are lindworms, great serpents. And they're like dragons. The dragons depicted on Viking ships, they say, the Viking ships have dragons on them. This is the kind of thing they depict. And if you saw those wall murals with the snaking things on them, this is the thing that snakes on the wall in all those churches and that are on the prow of a lot of those ships. And a lot of you have heard of the Midgard serpent, the one that encloses the earth. It is indeed one of these, but it is only one of them, and it's the largest, but there are many others. And so we wanted to include one that was, small-ish, comparatively. And so you could beat it up without all the water falling off the earth. This is a Gru. We also had to bring them into this universe and sort of find a way for this shape or form to sort of be in a lot of the mystical creatures of the world that we brought forward and sort of updated our universe with. And okay, so this is Kittelsen again. In addition to doing all this, well, this is also the fantastic depiction, but he had a fascination with death, which is also something we wanted to have as a subject in our game, sort of lingering things. And so this is also, like, this looks like a normal, this looks like a non-fantasy portrait. However, Norway was struck particularly hard by the Black Plague back in the day. And during the Black Plague, we lost the majority of the population. And there was a depiction of death, which is this pesto. And essentially, it's not a man with a scythe, but it is a woman with a rake. But the objective is the same. She basically harvests, but she represents not death itself exactly, but she represents the plague. There's a fellow harvester. And this is actually a non-fantasy portrait, also Kittelsen, but that just depicts the plague directly, because you could get into these farms and it would be completely abandoned. Like, there's a last name in Norway called Ødegård, which just means abandoned farm, which is the last name you would get if your family took up an abandoned farm that was left after the plague. But if you enter these places, you need a strong stomach. So, and again, this is a draug that is, again, you can see the sailor's hat here, but it is basically a revenant brought back, or not by a person in the historical case, but by longing things that they have not finished, or business left on earth. So, we get to the game. This is also a draug. Our version of it has to be brought back by science and not magic. So we wanted to bring them back with electricity. I mean, it's a good old traditional way of bringing people back in these kind of stories. But we wanted to make them feel unique from a lot of our other creatures. These things in the game, they start very sluggish. Some of them are actually just corpses on the ground. But you have a ton of electrical powers, and if you use one of them near them, they will become energized and start walking around. And as they become more and more energized, become more and more dangerous. And this is their last state before, if you blink through it again here, it explodes. But do so quickly, because it's not happy to see you. And again, sort of taking everything that I mentioned from nature and sort of from what we had, and having the intrusion of the unnatural into the natural. This was a moose. Now it's something else. But the fun part is that as long as it doesn't sort of bellow, it doesn't betray how much of a shell it is, essentially. So you can sort of pass a little bit. It looks weird with its electric antlers, but when you see that, you go that is not a moose. And that's sort of showing a little bit of the horror of reincarnation, resurrection as well. So, folktale character, well known to Norwegian. Specifically, this looked like a girl, but she has a tail. So this is a Hulder. Hulders in Norwegian folk tales are mischievous. They could occasionally be nice, but they could also trick you, and they would lure young men into the mountain where they were never to be seen again. And so the Hulders could have a lot of the appearance of a woman, but there would always be features giving them away. And so we wanted to have like a character like that in our tale as well. Because Hulders are nature spirits, essentially. They're very connected to nature. And our Hulder looks like this. But as you see, she's also sort of related to the Grus and sort of has some of their features. She doesn't have the exact same eyes. But actually, on several occasions, her hair goes back a bit, and you see she has more eyes above the hairline. There's like several things she does that you see her a bit in the beginning. She looks more human-like, but then she does certain things that betrays more sort of monstrous attributes, because she is not a human. In fact, she chases you quite a bit in the beginning of the game. Although the relationship with Hulder is something that changes a little bit through the game as well. It's one of the characters that we have in our story. I mean, as I mentioned before, it's a game with no words in it whatsoever. But both in Tesla-grad 1 and Tesla-grad 2, we have some large portions where you see what the story is. Like, there are things that happen to you, there are characters that interact with you wordlessly, where you pick up exactly sort of what's going on, what's happening. For both games, we sort of had to try out a lot of these things, show them to people, see if they could sort of tell me back what the story is, see what worked in sort of silent storytelling. And then we had to change some things on occasion with people that wouldn't understand it. Especially, as I mentioned, like your relationship with Hulder changes during the story. That means you have to have a character development, but you can't write words. And so you have to sort of figure out how to do that. Luckily, I mean, a lot of people have done a lot of silent media before, and there's a great deal of sort of good tricks have been used in a ton of it. But if you do this, I would actually recommend drawing stuff out as a cartoon first, or as a comic. And just show people the comic, and it has to be wordless as well, of course, and then ask them, like, what happened here? And they will recount to you. And if they misinterpret something, then you probably need to redraw it before you start doing it in life. This is Halvdan and the Vikings. So, of course, we're going to have Vikings in the game. I already mentioned the platform. These are our happy airship Vikings. What does that look like? That looks like that. So, of course, these guys in the story are definitely antagonistic to you, but they have good reason to be. I'll get to that when I get to the bad guy. But essentially, right, these guys do threaten you, oppose you. They are a big sort of menacing force in the world. You have to deal with them, you have to escape them quite a bit, and eventually you can fight them as well. You can actually play this game without ever murdering a Viking, but that is definitely an option to do. When you get to sort of their platform, like later in the game, you see like the kind of carvings you would see in this place, and of course it has to be a little explosive as well. And you see the roofing here, the slight curving, and everything, like trying to take all the elements from everything we learned on our trips and our stuff like that and pour it back into the game. And of course, I mean, that was bound to happen. At some point, we had to blow up the platform because it would have just been unfulfilled potential if we did not. And you escape on the ship there, so you get away with it. So the creation of the character Lumina, of course, there's a large basis of, because she's our sort of, like we have had several other games in our universes as well, but in the Tesla-grad and Tesla-grad 2 case, she's sort of the second protagonist. So she has to inherit a lot from the previous protagonists, while we also wanted to make her somewhat unique in some ways. This is basically her granddad and her dad. The dad being like the protagonist of Tesla-grad 2, this guy. And you can notice like there are some design similarities. All the Tesla launchers have their blue hoods, and there's like a little design element where there's like a little which is an electrical system, like a symbol in their character design with their cloak. That we always repeat with them, but these two Teslamancer are guys, right? And she's a gal, so it's a good opportunity to sort of change up the uniform a little bit, sort of what goes into this stuff. We're designing it quite a bit, and sort of the Taskmasters already have like elements from. This is a Nissa, by the way. These are Norwegian folklorian creatures. Wizards, I guess, are well known. The again. Tesla with this good old electrical stuff. We wanted to, when we show electrical stuff on them, we wanted to be like have this kind of feeling of the kind of stuff he made. So that's why you get like this kind of equipment here. And this thing is a Norwegian traditional dress. It's a bunad. And so that we throw it all together with the designs that we already had. And so we end up with a character you see here. This is actually originally a design from World to the West, which was the first game she appeared in. So, and this was where we ended up with that design. And in we changed her a little bit. We made her a little older, because obviously it's a later game, Tesla-grad 2. And we also wanted to make her a little bit more sort of, look a little bit tougher and like slight bit more Viking-y. And also since the setting is part of it, whenever you get an upgrade, you add things to the costume, and she just looks progressively more like she fits into the area throughout the game. So yeah, like features like having an axe, and that you get after a while, and sort of having this sort of setting in this kind of world. And sort of after a while, after having played for a long while, sort of belonging more and more to that world. So we had taken a lot of elements from sort of the original game, and more than enough that people who love the original game recognized it immediately. They said, yes, this is Tesla-grad. But also like, wow, but we're in a new place, right? Something good is very frequently the combination of something new and something old. The old needs to be there to feel warm and familiar and bring people in, and the new needs to be there so they're not bored. If it's all new, then you get frightened and confused. And if it's all old, they get bored and leave. So, we also need a baddie. That's the historical Galvan. Galvan is, we wanted to make a baddie that was very much like, or had an association with the good guys in this case. So, from science history, Galvan is the guy who finds out about bioelectricity. If you're going to make a bad guy Teslamancer, and those are guys are all about electricity, you take the guy who ended up unwillingly, in part, creating what was essentially a cult of resurrection. Galvan was able to make dead frogs' legs move. And in his time, where people were rather religious, people believed that he had tapped into the very sort of core of creation, bringing things back to life and playing God. And so they ended up getting galvanists at many sort of universities and things like that around Europe, where they for real tried to bring people, cadavers back to life. And like this got a practice, they got them a bad reputation with a very Christian Europe. And that, like when Mary Shelley wrote her Frankenstein story, those types were very much the inspiration for Dr. Frankenstein, who also uses electricity. So our Galvan is not exactly the historical Galvan, but he has brought others and himself back from the dead. This is a character who believes he is entirely noble, because there's a history here, right? And again, this is in a game where we have to tell history entirely through wall murals, statues, and other sort of things like that. Part of this history is shown in Tesla-grad 1, and like it is embellished quite a bit in Tesla-grad 2. Now, the problem with Wormheim originally is that they used to raid their neighbors. I mean, that's an idea we got from nowhere. So, as the solution to that, the Tesla-masters who were from sort of the Eastern European area depicted in the first game decided to put a stop to this by invading them. And then after invading them, they find out, oh wait, now we actually have to stay here so that they don't rise up again. They build a new tower there. The tower eventually collapses. The only survivor is Galvan, but he has some ideas on how to sort of get some assistance there. So he brings a lot of folk back, and he starts keeping the tower even when the Tesla-Mancer order essentially crumbles in other places, and he hasn't been contacted for years. He views himself as the one bastion against these evil barbarians. They view him as an evil foreign wizard who does strange things that they do not understand. But this guy has gotten, like, over time, he has no sort of sympathy for the people locally whatsoever. He has gotten quite, well, gruesome. And this is also a large reason why the Vikings don't like you. Because this guy has a lot of design similarities with Lumina. He is a Tesla-Mancer, he uses electricity, he has the cloak, he has everything. So when they see her, they kind of see him. And he does too. So he basically acts like as a mentor for the first half of the game, trying to conceal a little bit of his nature there. Eventually you do have to face this guy though, because he turns out to be a little bit more monstrous than you can possibly accept. And it kind of also stops you from being able to leave, forcing the conflict. Now, this is Galvan in the game. Some of his animations. But this is also as well like revealing the character a little bit. As long as this cloak is completely on, he looks a little bit more sympathetic perhaps, a little bit less monstrous. But as it comes off, you see there's something wrong with both hands, his face is half gone. And he has some future ideas of how you could assist him, I guess. Also some artistic talent. But at the end of the game, of course, you have to take him down. So, a final character that is sort of mentioned even after this guy is because she is a bit of a secret-ish in the game. And that is Eleanor, and we based her on Hel. Hel, or Hela for the English speakers, is a northern goddess of the dead, who is considered to be half alive and half dead, like half and half. And of course, our character is not literally called Hel, as she is called Eleanor. And she is technically your great-grandma. And she is depicted a lot of places as the original ruler of this area. So this is one of the ways to sort of, because their presence is sort of felt throughout the entire game. Galvan's is as well, but like, she was the big boss in the past, so like she has the big statue in most places. But she's gone now, because she died. Galvan did bring her back, but she became insane, not entirely happy with what had happened to her, so she ended up sealed away. But if you do the right thing, like this as well is a little bit sort of a revealing monstrousness, because she can look very human, and then as she becomes agitated, she becomes very inhuman. Like there's very little hair, like there's no legs, there's hardly a torso. The arms are entirely projected. What you essentially have here is this part is somewhat human. I guess part of it. So she was very inspired by Hela and by sort of that figure. And again, we brought in the Tesla-Mancers things, and most Tesla-Mancers are blue. But we also knew that, like the polarities. The other half of the power in the original game, they were always depicted in red. And so she is a red Tesla-Mancer. Connected to like the lore of the original game, the king of Electropia, and the faction that ended up going against the Tesla-Mancer. That was technically after she died, so she never went bad before this happened. And this is her in the game. She's the secret boss, essentially. Well, not that secret anymore, I guess. But if you do everything, you get to face her, and that was enjoyable for me as well. I wanted to make a game everyone could complete, and she is after that, so good luck. But yeah, Tesla-grad is a game a lot about movement. Now I talked sort of about how we put everything together. It's sort of where we got the inspiration from, how we boiled it, and how we sort of created a new fantasy world. But the other half of it is about that. And like, it was very hard. Like, I really wanted to make a boss that demanded a lot of your movement, but then it becomes very hard to beat, because Tesla-grad is also a game that basically kills you in one hit. So keep your rhythm. This doesn't look good until I press play. This is the game. This is the trailer for Tesla-grad 2. You see everything how it came together in the end. want to rest properly on this one, so I'll just do that. All right, so I could talk about like details of the world and storytelling for like probably another day, but we're down to like an appropriate amount of time for questions. So, does anyone have any questions about Tesla-grad 2 and its world building and sort of how we got ideas for these characters? And did my explanation make any sense? Because I felt that, like I had to cliff note almost everything, but you know, it's still an hour, so yeah. Did it make any sense, like what we looked at, what we were grabbing, and where we ended up, for example? Or does anyone else have like a question or anything you guys were wondering about?
Have you taken any inspiration from Peer Gynt specifically at any point?
Not for this one the way it ended up, but we did think about it. Yeah. And we might do something with that later. That's also like a Norwegian work that has a lot of cool stuff in it, and that we would like to explore. But we don't think we've done so yet.
Okay. Will we possibly be able to see a character inspired by the character Peer Gynt in Tesla-grad 3? Ooh.
Possibly. Eh? my personal favorite thing from that is probably and not truly a character, but like an antagonistic force called Bacon, which is more or less representative of your own inability to move on and pass forward and own up to your mistakes in monster form.
Do you have a creature you regret not putting into the game, or something that you really want to, if you could like make one now?
Oh yeah, we had to cut the guy. Of course, that happens. You saw Nøkken earlier. It was included still, like the creature in the lake. We had to cut something as happened in productions. I don't think you can easily notice that these days that it's gone, but there was an underwater part of the world where you could manipulate water flowing through the air and stuff like that. Because since you can zip through water, like having water blobs floating around like pedals in a lava lamp was very cool. And you had this monster, like this absolute lake monster, that has this. When I say lake monster, don't think of serpent. Think of something that nøkken means like to pull down, like something that would grab your leg and then pull you under. And like this creature is very associated with water lilies and with ponds and with water and all these kind of things. And we had this whole idea of him and Hulder, like him having some attention for Hulder rejecting him, and some conflict existing there and with the character as well. So yeah, we wanted to have him in as a big monstrous dude, but no, unfortunately not.
Did you mention something about this Galvan guy?
Yes.
Does that have anything to do with like a galvanic element, like in chemistry, with like
galvanism?
Huh?
Galvanism?
Yeah.
Yeah, like well, obviously things are named. Like, he was a scientist. He made a lot of stuff, but he did not only try to resurrect frogs. He did also do other things. But like he made dead frogs move, so he came quite a way. Like that's the whole idea of putting electricity to a muscle and making the muscle flex, despite the corpse being dead. But galvan is also the origin of like galvanism, which is like using electricity to get metal to stick to a thing in a jig.
Yes. So it was kind of to create a parallel with him and Tesla.
Yeah, like I mean, the Tesla masters are electrical scientists, right?
Yeah,
and we based a lot of them on historical scientists that contributed to the field of electricity, and or like the Lumina is entire. Like her name is after lumen, which is another electrical unit or a unit of luminosity, but it's sort of in the same in sort of the scientific ballpark. So you have that group of sort of science-based rational people, and you have like the wild Vikings, and you have the bestial Grus and like Hulder, and the elements of nature in that sense as well.
So at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned how you went on a road trip to get inspiration regarding Norwegian culture and its visuals. Would you say that that was the initial objective of the project from the very beginning, to create that homage? Or it was just something that you since you live here, and you see this every day, just went, something is different, and I can see something created out of this that has not been done beforehand.
Much more the second one than the first, because I mean, a lot of things, like if you put something in West Norway, it's usually like a historical Viking drama or something. But I've never seen a fantasy based on that. If fantasy takes place in, like, I don't know, fantasy Germany mostly, it's nice and flat, and like the houses have this white houses with the black axes on them and things like that. I mean, I wanted to see like a science fantasy set in this area and see like if, because I think a lot of other cultures have done cool things with their past as well. Like the whole idea, like Japan created like Neo Tokyo, like you have this old traditional Japanese look on like super high advanced technology stuff. I think that is like an awesome concept. But like imagining doing something like that with the like local culture, and like not necessarily bringing it into the far future, but at least bringing it into the sort of Victorian era level decent technology. Like if the people who made a stave church would create a factory hall, for example, which is also something we do here, how would they build it? If they had other tools than just trees, so if they could build stuff in steel, what would it look like? If they kept like the aesthetic sense and like doing things in that way. So yeah, it was to take the stuff here, remember what it looked like, and then mutate it horribly to make like a new expression and a new thing.
And did you say that you see that players are understanding what you're transmitting, or that's a homage to that specific part of Norway? Or
I mean, they find the place to be unique and original, and they like it a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you're from here, you recognize it. But I don't think it's important that you know it's from Norway. Essentially, it's just that it is like you haven't seen this before, and that it feels interesting. It feels like a place you want to explore. Like, and what I wanted to get across was like the kind of sort of sense of adventure I get when I look at this stuff. Not necessarily that you need to know that stuff is over here, but like look at this insane nature. Look at these like these ancient carvings. Look at this strange other culture that existed once upon a time, and then show it to people in sort of a new way. Well, again, we're not historically accurate. We have Sky Vikings, so. But like that in itself, like they can still be Vikings. They still raid stuff. They do Viking-y things, and then you have sort of a new twist on it.
all right, thank you.
Hi, is the game tailored to a specific platform?
This thing is for a lot of platforms. I think it would probably work better on. It works best if you can get a controller in your hands. You can definitely play on PC with a controller. That's a perfect experience. But keyboard is okay experience. A lot of people do actually prefer that, but I think it's like slightly worse, especially for casual players. But of course, this is on both the current Xboxes, both the current PlayStations, and Switch as well. We have sold quite a lot of copies on Switch. I think people like games like this on the Switch.
Yeah, I was thinking that direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that is also like a good place to play it. But yeah, it actually we kept stuff very parallel. And we released everything on every platform at the same time. So it's not like we built everything and then we ported it in a sense. Like we kept an eye on everything as we went through development. So it's not horribly mangled on any of the platforms.
Yeah, thank you. It looks gorgeous.
Thank you.
Hi. Just wondering, do I have to play Tesla-grad 1 first?
Well, I had to create it first.
Oh, should I play Tesla-grad 1 first?
That depends a little bit. If you have patience for one platformer, I would actually recommend Tesla-grad 2. But like Tesla-grad 1, like a lot of people swear by it, and it's like we did really well with that. Over time, we ended up selling like 2 million copies of that game. So there's definitely a lot there as well. There is, and you can get bonuses. Like it's not like if you haven't played Tesla-grad 1, you won't get the story for Tesla-grad 2. But you'll get a lot of the little references we put in. You see the character connections that are not always obvious and stuff like that. And it's even like both games are silent, but you'll still recognize like, that connects like that. These two people are related. That's how that works. This is why that guy like is here or what they're doing, and that's the background for it. So if you love lore, especially, you should play them in sequence.
Thank you.
When you make this game, do you sort of figure out all the lore stuff at first and then make the game? Or does it come about more organically as you go through the process?
We figure out the core, but we usually have to fiddle around with it a little bit. Like a big problem in the way we do these games is readability, right? If something doesn't read, or if we feel that some parts of the stories are missing, we can't just close the gap with another text dialogue or scroll you find in a library somewhere or something like that. The story has to actually read. And that means that sometimes we change something around, but we always have like, this is the large arc of the game, it's the main story that we're telling. These are the positions of the main characters in the story. And then the small interactions, we very often have to figure out more as we go in order to make it work. Guys, we tried as well, like we figured out that boss fight, for example, if you fight like around a monster, that's fun, but it's more fun to fight a character that's actually engaged in the story. And then you wanted, for some reason, you wanted him to have like do a certain thing in the boss fight, and then try to do that, and then it's no fun, or you can't make it work. Like, we have to change the story because we can't do a mechanic thing. Again, like this is stuff that happens when you tell the story with the actions in the game. That means that the actions in the game then influence the story in the other direction as well, if something is just not practical.
Okay.
And Ole especially, like our art director, put in like a ton of, like he came up with after a while, like because we had an equivalent in Tesla-grad 1, you have like mechanical theaters that tell a lot of the backstory. We never stop you for cutscene either, so we made it doubly hard for ourselves to tell all the story. But the mechanical theaters, when you pass them, they just start moving and play music and indicate that perhaps you should stay. But then you can just leave while it runs. But if you watch them, you see a lot of the backstory there. And in Tesla-grad 2, we made sort of these strange, ancient sort of television-like screens that show like flashes from historical events and stuff like that. Still completely silent, but that shows some of the things that happened in the past. There was also like things you must find through the game start. I guess it's our equivalent of finding like some notes. But again, it's visually told and it's in the setting. You're not paused or anything. You can just leave the screen as it's playing.
Yeah, cool. And those Stickelson paintings were awesome. Are those publicly available anywhere?
Yeah, like most of them are. A lot of them are on display. If you want to see them physically, you must check the museum sites of Norway and figure out where they're currently at, because they're tourney and move around. And no, I think all of them are probably depicted on the internet, so just look them up.
Hi, it's me.
Hi.
No, I just... no, yeah.
Yep.
That's it for the questions, I believe. Awesome. I just showed up.
Yeah.
I'm just, hello. All right. No, I just dropped by to let you know that we're going to have a quick break until 15:30. And then be sure to be back by 15:30 though, for the epic conclusion where we'll listen to Lisa Anderson from Riot. That's going to be awesome. So see you then. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go get some painkillers. Yes, welcome back. Woo! Woo! All right, yes, because this is it. This is the finale, the climax. Are you all ready for the last talk? All right, then I always wanted to say this. Put your hands together for Lisa Anderson from Riot with Introduction to Practical AI.
Hello, Konsoll. How are you guys all doing? All right, you guys all had a break, so do we need another stretch break? I thought that was great from the first guy, or are we all good to go? Good to go? All right, before I get started, I just wanted to say thank you to all the volunteers and organizers who are helping to make Konsoll happen. This has been an amazing event, and I'd like to give them a round of applause. And now, I am Lisa Anderson. I am a principal technical artist at Riot Games. Before Riot, I've done a little bit of everything within the gaming space. I've worked AAA studios, indie startups, cinematics. I've done live service games, R&D projects, and even a little bit of app development. And one thing that has been a common theme throughout all of these jobs has been that I love bringing new tech to all of the projects that I work on. And that's why I'm super excited today to talk to you guys a little bit about AI and its use in video games. Now, AI gets a little bit of a bad rap. We've seen in the writers' strike and the SAG strike that people are fighting for protection against AI. And there's a lot of sentiment that I'm sure we've all heard about people being afraid that AI is going to take their jobs. On the flip side, there's also this feeling that AI is akin to magic. Those of us who are really excited about it, like you give data to the machine, magic happens, and then what you want comes back. And while all of these things are true in small parts, none of these things are fully true. So that's what I want to do today. I want to clear the record about what AI is and how it is actually being used. The agenda for today's talk is going to be first talking about what is AI. Then, what is machine learning? Because the two have slight nuances. They're not quite the same, even though they're frequently used interchangeably. Then we'll talk a little bit about my personal experience and the experiences I've learned from teams that I've been on that have used AI. And finally, we're going to end with being a good citizen of AI, because hopefully by then you're excited about AI and you want to use it too, so you should be aware of the ethics of it and what you need to be concerned about when you get started too. I am going to try to keep this high level. I'm not going to dive too deep into any math, so hopefully this is a really accessible talk. But if you're excited to nerd out, come and find me afterwards. And my final disclaimer, unless otherwise stated, the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not reflect that of my company. So let's get started. What is AI? Because if we look at these two images, the NPC on the left, who is pathing straight into a wall, feels very different than the generative AI. But these are both called AI within the gaming sphere. And when you have a conversation with your NPC AI, it feels very different than when you have a conversation with ChatGPT. One of these is on Rails. You have a limited number of options you can ask your NPC and a limited number of responses back. Whereas with ChatGPT, you can ask it anything, and it will respond with usually pretty reasonable responses. You can even have follow-up conversations. So that's within the gaming sphere. It gets more complicated because there's AI outside of games too. Like, what about robotics? What's the through line with all of these? What's common about all of them? Are they all truly AI, or are some of these called AI incorrectly? I consider AI to be programming meant to mimic human behavior. And if we then take a look at these three examples through that lens, they are all truly AI, just subcategories of AI. NPC AI, when you have a sim and you build a pool, and then you remove the ladder from that pool, your sim is going to behave. They're going to react very differently to that environment than if you get your sim a pet. And that interaction with the environment is a very human trait, right? Machine learning, I mean, it's in the name. Learning, problem solving. These are traits that are often associated with humans. And finally, robotics. I don't have another image because if you don't feel bad for the robot having the thing knocked out of its hands and then being pushed around, oh, you're a monster. So, AI, programming meant to mimic human behaviors. And so we can look at it like this. Part of the reason why the space is so complicated is because machine learning really has overlap with a lot of other areas of AI. So you can apply machine learning to your NPC AI, and you can apply machine learning to robotics, which is why the AI space gets a little complicated. So I want to try to unravel some of the complication today. We're going to start with our base foundation here, which is AI. We just talked about it. And in the same way that the technology has built upon the foundation it's laid over time upon itself, it just keeps building on what was before it, that's how we're going to dive deeper into machine learning specifically. So we talked about our base. We've talked about what AI is, programming meant to mimic human behavior. Now we're going to talk about the subcategory of machine learning where pattern recognition is learned. That's what machine learning is. So what does that mean? Pattern recognition is learned. That's just kind of a lot of garbage, right? Mumbo jumbo. What that means is instead of telling the computer what you want it to be looking for, you're going to give the computer a whole bunch of example data. And then you're going to say, this is the problem. I want you to figure out what the optimal solution is. In this case, in this image, you might give the computer 1,000 images of cats. And you're going to label them all as cats so the computer knows. And then you might give the computer 1,000 images of dogs. And you will likewise label them as dogs so the computer knows. And you're going to tell the computer, I'm going to give you a random image. I want you to properly do what you have to do in order to categorize this as either cat or dog. And then you would give the computer the thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, you got that right. No, you didn't. So it could train over time. And it might start to decide pointed ears. I recognize those. That's probably a cat. But this is a space where you have to be careful because it's really powerful to let the machine learn and decide what is the most important feature. But what if all of the pictures of cats, just by chance, had a white border? The machine might stop recognizing the features of a cat, and it might start recognizing that a white border is what means properly classifying cat. So while this is really powerful, there are some gotchas that you have to be careful of. And I said I'm going to try to keep this high level. So in like coding, we would consider that an algorithm is just a series of instructions. They can be simple, they can be complex. And that would equate in like daily life to a recipe, which is a series of instructions that can also be simple or complex. And if we follow this recipe to make a cookie from start to finish, we would end up with a very good cookie. But we would not be machine learning, because we are following an explicit set of instructions, and in no part of this did we do any interpretation or any learning of our own. If we wanted to make this cookie with machine learning, what we would do is we would give the computer a whole bunch of cookies. And then we might give the computer some variables, like ingredients, oven temperature, baking time. And we would let the computer learn what it needed to do in order to make a cookie. And similarly, we'd give it the thumbs up, thumbs down. It starts with mostly flour. That makes a terrible cookie. And then it would learn to add more butter. And that makes a much better cookie. And over time, as it repeats this experience over and over, after many rounds of repetition, much like learning and problem solving, it would finally give us a recipe that would make a pretty good cookie. And now, Google actually did this. They had a machine every morning make a recipe for a cookie. And then the chefs at Google would go ahead and make that cookie. And they would put it out, compare it side by side with a store-bought cookie. And the developers would numerically rank the cookies to compare them until the machine got very good at making cookies. In this example, I want to use the term model, because that's going to come up a lot during this talk. I'm trying not to use a whole lot of tech jargon, but that's a really important one. And what a model is, in the example of the cookie, it's the recipe, the thing that you trained it on a bunch of chocolate chip cookies and the machine figured out more butter, the oven temperature, the stuff it needed to do. And then you give it something the next time, like, I don't know, oatmeal and raisins. That's a slightly different cookie, but based off of the recipe, it should still be able to figure out. It should still use all of the previous problem solving it did to apply it to these new ingredients to still make you a cookie. That's the idea of a model. It's the place where all of the problem solving that it's done in the past is stored so that it can continue to solve the problem for additional data. Just wanted to make it clear because I will use that throughout this talk. So, where does machine learning shine? It is really good at clustering similarities. It can even recognize similarities in data that humans have trouble recognizing. And by that token, it's really good at recognizing anomalies. If you can recognize things that all belong together, you can recognize the outliers in the data as well. It's really good at complex statistical analysis and prediction. So, said this was going to be about games. What do we do with this? Why does it matter? Let's say that you're a small indie developer like Riot, and your games are free to play. So how do you make your money? You sell skins. And every single one of these slots in the store, therefore, is a really valuable opportunity to generate revenue. And I Teemo main, so if you offer me a Teemo skin that I don't own in the store, I'm gonna buy it. But Teemo is a very polarizing character. People either love him or they hate him. And it's pretty close to a 50-50 split. So if you offer Teemo to somebody who hates him, they're not likely to rage quit and never play again, but you've lost an opportunity to generate money in your store because it's a guarantee that he or she will never buy that skin. And that's the premise behind the shop. Your shop is custom to every player around the world. They're analyzing all of those players' data to give them the best possible store experience because it's good for you as a player, right? You don't want options for skins that you hate, and they don't want to not make money. This is not a fake image. This is actually an image from my shop. That on the far end was a Teemo skin that I didn't own. I bought it immediately. Didn't even look at the price, no questions asked. Now, I didn't have to look at the price because Riot gives me some RP, but that's a different story. So they correctly analyzed my playstyle. They correctly analyzed the players and the champions I like, the skins I like, and they offered me something in the shop that I wanted. So how did they do this? What was the machine learning behind this? And first what they did was they cluster players into groups of similar players, and then you cluster champions into groupings of similar champions. But then you have to do some complicated math to filter out the noise, because there's 165 champions, which means thousands of skins. And I own a lot of them, but I really only play 2 champions. So you don't want to have your analytics saying, hey, what skins does this person own? Maybe they'll like this one. You don't want that analysis being polluted by skins that I technically own, but really don't care about. I just got them for free from an event or something like that. So you need to remove all of the extraneous data in order to have a hyper-focused prediction for your players. So how are we measuring if we've done well? The primary 2 are accuracy, which are, did you sell that skin or not? And coverage, because there are some players who just won't receive a custom recommendation. Maybe they're new to the game and we just don't have the data for them. Or maybe they're returning after a long absence. And these other 2 are used, but they're not as big as the first 2, so we're gonna go ahead and skip them for time. So, what are the challenges with machine learning? Because there's a lot more on our pyramid. Why are we trying to continue developing this technology? Machine learning as a broad category just doesn't have additional accuracy gained with large data sets. There's a point at which it gets better and better and better and better, and then it plateaus off, so it just doesn't matter how big your data set is. Base subject matter knowledge is required. You really need to know what you're building towards with this broad level of machine learning. And similarly, you need to be able to validate the results. And complex behavior, like feature recognition in images, is an area where the broad category of machine learning struggles a little bit, which is how we get to neural networks, our next level of this pyramid, building upon machine learning. neural networks are designed after how the brain works. So in the brain, you have an input signal. It sends off to a series of synapses and neurons, which all light up in succession, until finally there's an output signal, and you do something, like wave your hand. With neural networks, you have the same thing. There's an input layer, a series of connected nodes that are hidden, and they do the magic I talked about earlier. They tune your data very finely until there's an output layer, and that's what comes back to us. So they can do really complicated things. And that's where neural networks shine. That's why you move up why this area of machine learning was developed. It's excellent with large data sets. The more data you have, the better. It's great because of the connected nature of all of those hidden nodes at interpreting raw data in context, because things like a single image pixel don't matter outside of their context. But in context, they can be used for things like facial recognition, which is really powerful. They're really great with feature-dense or abstract data sets because they can find patterns in really unstructured data. They don't just have to follow mathematical equations or linear equations to do predictions and things. They're really good at finding patterns. And because there's so many nodes and they're so connected, that all of that data can be finely tweaked. So you can have almost abstract seeming patterns within your data. So how are these actually used in games? One of my favorite examples is QA testing. We're going to be talking throughout all of the examples of QA from EA Seed examples. And EA Seed is an applied research division of EA. And this quote, "A case study for automated testing is Battlefield 5, which requires testing of 601 different features, amounting to around 500,000 hours of testing if done manually. This corresponds to about 300 work years." And I think we can all agree, not very tenable. So what happens? There's some automation, but a lot of features just don't get the full testing coverage that they need. So is this an area that machine learning, neural networks could help? And yes, with reinforcement learning, and in this image, this is random coverage. So the AI is just sent randomly into the world. In this one, RL policy stands for reinforcement learning policy. And in this one, with reinforcement learning, what that means is the AI is rewarded for novel behavior. So that encourages exploration. It's rewarded if it explores an area of the map that it hasn't explored before. And you can see how much greater a coverage of the map that's creating. And why is that powerful? Why do we want that? Well, first of all, with these huge open world games, it's just not feasible for a human to be able to test all aspects of that. So you're going to focus on areas where you have story points or where you have gameplay elements that you want your players to interact with. But your players can still access the entire rest of the map. Well, with this reinforcement learning, you have much better map coverage. So you're more likely to find exploits in the geometry or places where your players might get stuck. And that's really powerful. However, it's not the end-all be-all, because reinforcement learning, because how it encourages that exploratory behavior, means that your AI agents are going to be optimized specifically for exploration. So if there's gameplay mechanics like button presses that you want them to do, they may randomly hit it, but they are not optimized to perform those gameplay elements. They also require millions of rounds of repetition to generate that kind of coverage. So you can see here, they're not getting to the final spot on the map where you might want them to. And it's going to take them 1,000,000 rounds, maybe not 1,000,000, but millions of rounds of repetition to get there. So that's why it needs to be paired with something like imitation learning. And imitation learning is where an AI learns from a developer. The developer will go through a series of mechanics and teach the AI what it should do. In this case, go from point A to point B, push a button, enter the door. And the AI will attempt to replicate that behavior even with changes happening to the environment. So you remove the fence, you add an obstacle. The AI is still going to attempt to perform that test. And that's really powerful. But again, imitation learning is not the only part of this story, because there are areas where even neural networks, as powerful as they are, will fall short. Like with cosmetics. You're always going to need your human QA testers, because I don't even know how you would train a neural network to identify that this is a problem. World of Warcraft creatures have spikes, so that looks weird to us, but could be reasonable to a machine. That could just be a spiked tail, and it would be incredibly difficult for the machine to understand that this is a problem. But it's very easy for a human to spot that, and I know that because one of my coworkers, Ty, when he got hired and was asked why he wanted to work on World of Warcraft, said he got that mount in Warlords of Draenor, and it was driving him nuts that it was still broken, and since the developers weren't going to fix it, he needed to become a developer so he could fix the problem. And I thought that was a very cheeky answer, but it worked for him, and he got hired, and it is now fixed. So there are areas where humans will always outshine machines. So what are the challenges with neural networks? One is validation of output. That still requires a human to make sure things are okay. Computational power, this is one that is unlikely to affect you if you're working on personal projects and you have a decent GPU. But if you're working with huge data sets for your company, this could be a problem, because ChatGPT is cited as having been trained on 10,000 GPUs. And most of us don't have access to that kind of computational power. It also has a requirement for large data sets. Like I've been saying, the more data you have, the better it is, but you really need a base of a large set of data in order to get something good out of a neural network. And finally, those hidden nodes, that interconnected nature of all those nodes, it's hidden. It's incredibly difficult to debug or to know what's going on. So those are the challenges. And the next level of our pyramid is the generative adversarial network, or GAN. And the GAN solves one of these problems, the validation of output. And the reason it doesn't solve the other problems is because it's actually two neural networks competing against each other. You have one, and that's the generator, that's attempting to create data. And it's attempting to create data good enough to fool the other neural network, which is the discriminator, which acts like a detective. And so this doesn't have to be images, but in the example of images, you'd have the generator trying to forge an image good enough to match the training data set. And the detective or discriminator is attempting to identify whether the image it received is a forgery or is part of the training data. And you might train it something like this, where you'd give each of those two neural networks 1,000 images of ducks. And then your generator is going to create something like this. You can see why it might have thought that it's a duck, it's got a bill, but it's not good enough to fool our discriminator. So our discriminator says, nope. And then our generator might come up with something like this. And I heard chuckles, yeah, to us, this is ridiculous. But it's got the image quality, and our discriminator hasn't been trained well enough to know any better, so it goes, that's pretty good image quality, it matches. That's a duck. And so our generator would continue making ridiculous ducks until our discriminator got better. And our discriminator might say, generator, I've started to learn that it's not the image quality that matters, it's the features. And that tail is ridiculous. So it says, not a duck. And this back and forth happens until eventually the generator is capable of making something that matches the training data set. And the most famous example of this is deepfakes. But my favorite example comes from OpenAI. And OpenAI trained AI agents to play hide and seek. The blue agents here are trying to hide, stay out of the line of sight of the pink agents. The pink agents are the seekers. And you can see that this is after a couple million rounds of repetition. And the behavior still looks very machine-like, kind of milling about. Couple million rounds of repetition later, though, it doesn't look like it's milling about randomly. It is interacting, the hiders are interacting with the environment. They've leveled up because they were losing the game. So they had to get better, and they started using the environment, which means that now our seekers have to also level up if they want to win. And they do. They learn to exploit a physics flaw in order to launch themselves out of the arena so that they can spot the hiders. And fun fact, I don't have an image of this, but it wasn't just the seekers that learned to exploit the world. The hiders also learned to exploit it. They learned that there was a flaw in the geometry of the wall, and so they learned to chuck that ramp out of the arena so the Seekers couldn't use it anymore. Which, I don't know, I love this. I think it's the perfect example of GANs. So how is this used? Or, okay, what are GANs great at? Validating against an existing data set. We saw that you have, the ducks, and it can compare against the ducks to see duck or not duck. It's good at generating content, again with the ducks. It's also good at matching existing content. So the requirement for large data sets, if you don't have quite enough to make your neural network successful, you could potentially use GANs to generate more data, so that way you could make a better neural network. And it's also really good at augmenting existing data. Because it's so good at recognizing features, like that's not a duck tail, it's also, that feature recognition allows it to do things like style transfer. So when you see those style transfer models out on the internet, it's probably a GAN. And it's used in video games in texture upres. Now, one of the most famous ones is one that you've probably played or at least know about, but is the re-release of the Mass Effect trilogy. But this is an incredibly accessible technology, which I think is awesome, because it's not just AAA companies or big studios that have access to this. It's like one modder, who's really excited about an old video game and has access to this technology. Most old games have a mod somewhere for a texture upres, because there's just somebody out there with a passion and access, and that's awesome. So, how does this texture upres GAN work? It's actually a very specialized GAN. It's called an Enhanced Super Resolution Generative Adversarial Network, which I know is a mouthful, but what it is actually doing is the generator is specialized. It's specialized at recognizing details and maintaining those details. And then the discriminator is also specialized. Instead of identifying part of the training set or not, what the discriminator is doing is identifying, is this image more or less realistic than the previous one, which is super awesome. But there are challenges with GANs. GANs are sometimes unstable. The discriminator can get too good, and then your generator just never has a chance to catch up. It's not a one GAN fits all. Enhanced super resolution generative adversarial network, they're very specialized to what they're doing. They also require a deep understanding of neural networks and the subject matter. And that's where generative AI comes in. Again, if you've used ChatGPT or Midjourney, they probably feel pretty stable. You can probably ask them a lot of different topics, and they'll respond. They are very much one size fits all, although they can be trained to be specialized. And using them does not require a deep understanding of the underlying technology, although if you want to make one, yes. So, we're now at the top of our pyramid. But historically, generative AI has existed as an idea for a very long time. In fact, this Eliza chatbot is from the 60s. The reason why generative AI is at the top of our pyramid now is because we are talking specifically about the modern iteration of generative AI. We're talking about our image generators, our music generators, our image generators. The two specifically that we're going to talk about today, because I believe they are the most commonly used, are going to be our image generators and our image generators and our text generators. So how does a text generator work? It's actually not understanding what you're saying. No matter how good it seems like it is at interpreting what you're asking it, no matter how reasonable the results are, it's actually just very good at prediction. The dog says. The dog can say a lot of things, but over the billions of articles and books that ChatGPT has been trained on, the most likely answer is woof. And same with what the cat says. Whole lot of different answers, but there's one that stands out as statistically the most probable, and that's what text generators are doing. Image generators are taking white noise, and they're denoising it progressively over time. It's the opposite effect of if you added a blur filter to an image. And each time it denoises, it's attempting to get closer and closer to the prompt that you've input. In this case, this is a model I trained to make my cat Michi. And you can see it needs a little bit more training, probably needs quite a bit better, larger set of data, but it's starting to recognize the features specifically of this cat, as opposed to my other cat, who you can tell not very close to. And I think that's really neat. So generative AI is a pretty new technology. Is it even being used in games yet? And the answer is NVIDIA was working on this in a really cool way. It was working on using natural language processing to recognize what people were saying into their headsets, and to then have that talk to an NPC who could respond to you and could respond directly to what you'd said. This was technology that one of the teams I was on was really excited about. We wanted to build an open world where you felt immersed and you could talk to anybody and have a new experience. So I investigated this, and there are some pitfalls you have to be aware of. One is you have to make sure that you're not saying something offensive to your players. You don't want your AI being trained on the internet, going out and swearing at all of your players. There's also something else called AI hallucinating. The AI likes to generate stuff. It is not necessarily generating stuff that exists, though. In this case, I asked ChatGPT to tell me all about neon pink artichokes, which do not exist. And ChatGPT was more than happy to tell me all about these neon pink artichokes. And the repercussions this can have for your game are that you spend so long carefully crafting the lore of your game that you want your NPCs to be grounded in it. You want your NPCs pulling on what you've created. You don't want your NPCs making up their own lore, hallucinating their own lore. So these are some challenges that if you want to use generative AI in games, you need to be aware of. Another example of AI hallucinating that I think is hilarious was Glorbo. Reddit noticed that there was a news site that was just going ahead and scraping data from Reddit and then generating articles indiscriminately. No fact checking. So they created a Reddit thread where they were excited for the new feature Glorbo. And if you actually read any of the details, mandatory item click-clack, farming sim mini game in World of Warcraft, you probably feel like maybe you should check on this, right? It feels a little sus. Not to a generative AI. More than happy to write an article about this. Reddit was absolutely thrilled. So, these examples have been from ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion. These are from huge companies. But you're probably interested, hopefully interested at this point, in what you as an individual or maybe a team of a couple people could accomplish. And this is where I want to tell you all about how you can identify what will be a successful project. You're not getting away from it. One is large data sets. Similarly structured data. We haven't really talked about this one, but the more similarly structured your data is, the easier it is to pattern recognize the things that you want the machine to learn. Simple, short problem. Can you state your problem in a single sentence? Good. Can you do it in a couple of words? Even better. And clear success metrics. Again, we've been talking about giving the machine, thumbs up, thumbs down, reinforcing the behavior. True or false is excellent. Yes or no is excellent. If it's a really nebulous, like, how do you tell if that's good? If you can't tell, how can the machine tell? And I like to boil this all down to, can this be outsourced? If you could reasonably send this problem to someone who doesn't speak your language, on the other side of the world, in a different time zone, and expect that the following day you're going to get a result back that's reasonable, it is probably a pretty good potential machine learning solution. So, let's talk about my favorite example, which was actually a personal project that me and my husband worked on. We call it the commercial quieter. We love watching American football, but hate watching the same car ad over and over. I don't know in Norway if your commercials are just always happen to be the same stupid truck ad. It's probably not trucks here, but it's always the same one. Really annoying. So the goal was commercial or not commercial. If it was commercial, you mute the sound. Really clear problem statement. We were also able to pull a lot of data because we were just grabbing screenshots. So we've got some pretty good hallmarks here. Really clear success metrics, really clear problem, a lot of data. And the commercial quieter was so successful that we had to add a buffer period because it kept unmuting the sound for single frames at a time when a football ad would play. So we're probably in roughly the 92-ish success rate in identifying commercials or football. So you'd think that this would be very clearly football and Reese's ad. In fact, you'd be wrong. The machine was certain that this was football. It was so convinced that it was football, it was in the 90th percentile. Haha, I got that right, that's football. Why? What under the hood was triggering it to think that this is football? It's recognizing the background. Large groups of similarly colored pixels hasn't picked up that the green of the football field is what's important. So how could we make this better? Similarly structured data. We could make this black and white. We could pre-process our data and take out that element so that we're focusing our neural network on something that matters. Large data sets. We could just chuck a whole lot more data at the problem. The more data the neural network has, the more accurate it is. And finally, we could potentially allow the machine to do what it's wanted all along. Identify football, Reese's ads, and car commercials or other commercials. This example is from World of Warcraft, texture tagging. And what I think is awesome here is that the goal was to unlock artists. World of Warcraft said, we want our artists focused on the things that matter, the big set pieces, the moments when players walk into a new area. And there's a lot of time being spent on things that players just never notice, like cobblestones or wood textures. But players would completely notice if it was just a gray box texture. And what World of Warcraft wanted was to give the artist artistic control, but speed up the process for them. So this model was based in 3 parts. One was solid lines would equal texture. Fine lines would equal stylistic details. And the third part of the model would combine the two to create a World of Warcraft texture. And the problem set, like the metrics, pretty easy. World of Warcraft texture, yes or no? Problem space, a little nebulous. It's a pretty tough question to ask, what is a World of Warcraft style? That's where it becomes a little difficult. And in terms of the data set, huge amount of, it's a, at this point, 17-year-old game, huge amount of final texture data to work with, but not a lot of that stenciled data to work with. So one tech artist spent months fixing and creating those stencils in order to build the training set required for this model. And why I think it's important to bring up is because machine learning is not without a lot of upfront cost. You can get a lot of value out of it, but you are going to need to take the time to pre-process your data, to build this model in the first place. And this was a huge technical success. World of Warcraft got a patent on this. Well, I guess Blizzard got the patent on it, but it was for World of Warcraft. But it ultimately got dropped. It did not get used in production because it was too time-consuming and too difficult for the artists to use. This is another example from World of Warcraft, which is armor refitting, specifically the helm. There are 44 different player characters if you count all the gender variants. And some of these helms need to fit across all of them. But you have things like the Tauron, which have snouts, or the Worgens, or the Volpera, and those snouts don't all match. The Volpera snouts are very narrow. The Tauron snouts are very big. So you need your helms to match all of these. And if you're an artist and you make an awesome mythic helm for the human male, which is typically the standard one, do you want to remake that helm 43 more times? Probably not. So it's a great problem set to automate. And this is where I can't talk anymore in detail about what World of Warcraft is doing specifically. The rest is under NDA. But in general, the way that this problem space is being solved in the industry could be procedural. It doesn't have to be machine learning. You could identify points on the human male face, like the lip corner, and then those matching points on the Volpera face, again, the lip corner where the snout ends. You can identify the difference mathematically between those two and apply that math to the helm to warp it. But there's problems with this version that's not machine learning. The players notice, because when you apply that math, it doesn't have pretty fall off. It's just going to stretch that geometry. It's just going to stretch that texture, and it's noticeable. So there is value to be had for the players if you can get the machine to do it via machine learning, via neural networks, to do it better and to identify maybe some nice blending so that it's slightly less clear that you're just using math to accomplish the problem. Then, from my team at Riot, search automation. And this may be one where you're thinking, what do you need machine learning for that? We've solved this for years. You type a keyword into a database, it identifies the same keywords, it returns you results. But what this search automation is doing is reverse image lookup. You could take something like this thumbnail and get results back like this, where you've identified the upres version of it. Or maybe the machine has recognized the character and returns you similar results for that character that are different. Or maybe it's recognizing the background. It could recognize that this is a seasonal image and return you other images or other assets that are also seasonal. And that's really powerful. And finally, my last one, auto skinning. This was a project that I worked on as a hackathon project and a passion project because I was doing rigging. And rigging means that you are going vertex by vertex and saying, you move with the shoulder, you move with the hip. And that's a very tedious process. And I thought, let's automate that with neural networks. So I generated really, hundreds of spheres in order to test this. I wanted my data to be as similarly structured as possible. So that way, if my machine learning model failed, then I would know that it was because of the model and not because of the data, which is why I worked with spheres and the same 5 set of joints. And I was somewhat successful. This was the result. It does apply skinning. But you can see that, especially if you look over here, it's not quite where you would expect. I was thinking this is an arm. Where you would expect the arm to be. It's a little too high. And that is because 400 or so spheres was not enough data. The machine did what's called overfitting to the data. It memorized the problem instead of solving the problem. So that is really just an average of all the spheres that I had used for the training data. And the reason why this failed, I think, is in a large part because I didn't go back to my basics. I tried to treat this as though it was magic. I tried to just send data to the machine, and I did that. I sent vertex data, joint position data, and then weight data. Just sent it all straight to the machine and said, do your best. Instead, I should have looked at how an artist actually works and approached the problem in the same way, identifying, are these verts related to the hips? Are these verts related to the shoulder? This becomes a much easier problem for machine learning to solve. It now becomes a classification problem, which we've already seen machine learning is great at. I should have been approaching this joint by joint, the way that a rigger actually does. So, as excited as we get for the technology, we need to remain grounded in where it came from, what we're trying to solve, rather than just being as excited as I was here. So hopefully, at this point, you are excited and want to work with machine learning. You want to try it. There's ethical and legal concerns here that you guys should be aware of. In the legal space, probably mostly affects you if you're building models, not using them. So let's take a look at that. I'll try to get through this fast because nobody likes legalese. The EU has put out the EU AI Act. This is legal regulation. Same with China. They've put out 3 laws. They are also legal. The US, from the White House, has put out the US AI Bill of Rights. They are just recommendations. They are not legal. And UNESCO has also put out recommendations. Again, recommendations, not legal. And what they all really boil down to is transparency in data. They want to be able to see that your data set was not illegally sourced, where you're getting your data from. They want traceable results. This one's incredibly difficult. They want, if you are predicting something, to know how you arrived at that prediction. That's a very tough one. Non-discriminatory behavior, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Data privacy, again, GDPR, trying to follow suit, things like that. And accountability. Even if a machine makes a decision, at the end of the day, the accountability comes back to a human. But there's difficulty in regulating this space. Lawmakers often lack AI knowledge. Even those of us who are excited about the tech sometimes lack this knowledge. The speed of AI development China put out 3 laws in succession, 2021, 2022, and 2023. The 2022 law narrowly missed generative AI by a matter of weeks. And industries are often global. You need global agreements to regulate this space, because otherwise, if you don't like the laws in one place, you pick up and move your company someplace else. But I think more likely to be something that we should be aware of here is as a user. What are the ethical concerns if you want to use AI? Social manipulation and misinformation. Deep fakes are very, very good. So this is something I'm not going to dwell on because I think we all know what it means. Privacy and security. It's potentially not just your address or your phone number on the internet now. It's your face, facial recognition. Bias and discrimination, whether from the people who built the model or in the training data set. If there is bias there, it will propagate through the model. And finally, this is the one that I think affects us the most. So this is where we'll spend the most of our time, creativity and ownership. If you use a series of Rembrandts to train a model and somebody else makes an image with that, who owns that? Is it the person who made the image? Is it you as the person who made the model? Rembrandt? And finally, where did all of that training data come from? Was it all legally sourced? So, art style mimicry. This is one that we all are often very concerned about. What if you use the name of a specific artist in the prompt? Calico cat with a white belly in a bowl in the style of Van Gogh. There's a lot of legal, space that's opening up here. There are a lot of lawsuits out that we need to pay attention to. Artists have put out lawsuits against generative images, and writers have put out some lawsuits against text generators. So this space remains to see how it evolves, but right now it's looking like, based off of unfair competition, it would be illegal. Adobe Firefly is attempting to be ethical in this space, which is something that's very cool. Adobe Firefly is training on its stock images and open source images. So that way, the training data set is not something you need to be worried about. It hasn't been scraped from people who did not give consent. And further, they're adding a tag that you can apply to your images for do not train. So that way, your art, your images, could potentially never be used in the training data. You can opt in. GitHub Copilot is attempting to do the same thing for code, which is awesome. And ethical, right? Because they're using open source repositories? Potentially not. There is litigation against GitHub Copilot, so we need to keep an eye on this. And what about mood boards? This one I find interesting, because most artists I know get started by going to the internet when they have a new asset that they want to make. They look up art from their favorite artists, they generate an inspiration board or a mood board, and then they make their own art. And that doesn't feel bad to me. It feels fine. But somehow, to me, it feels different when the AI is doing the same thing. I don't know how you feel. This is not an ethical question I can answer. This is something each of you needs to be aware of and answer for yourself. But it's something to consider. And finally, I do want to address the elephant in the room. Job loss. This is something that people are very afraid of with AI coming into this space. It's not something I'm terribly afraid of because in the past, throughout history, we've seen fear over things like ATMs. People worried that that's going to replace the bank teller. But we still have bank tellers. We just have now a convenient way of having easy transactions. I just want money. I don't need to talk to a person for that. But the bank teller still exists because cashier's check. You know, there's places where humans will always be in this space. One example that I think is really fun is with spreadsheets. People were afraid that spreadsheets would replace accountants. But actually, it generated more work for them. Because once things like Microsoft Excel came out, then all of a sudden, it was cheaper to just crunch the numbers for some alternatives. And so there was actually a lot more work for accountants. I think that this is how this space is going to go as well. I think there will be jobs that will be automated away. But where those jobs are automated away, I think that there will be job growth because we're already seeing needs for data scientists, for data engineers, even not on the technical side, for prompt engineers, people who know how to phrase what you want so that way you're getting the best results back from your generators. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom here. I see a bright future. But I understand that this is a space that people are very concerned about. One thing that I take heart from, and for my conclusion, is that every example I've put up here, every company I've worked at, when we are trying to make our models, we're doing it with the artist in mind. Because when we hire an artist, we're not hiring an artist because they're good at Photoshop. We're hiring an artist because they have something special in their mind. They have a vision that nobody else has, and that's what we're hiring them for. So all of the models that we're working on, it's to unlock the artist. It's to make them faster at getting what's in their head onto paper, onto screen, because that's what we want. We're not trying to automate away artists. I'm a tech artist. I love your visions. I'm a support character, and I want to stay there. I don't want AI to take that away. I want AI to help you get there faster. And that's what I love about this. So that's how I feel about it. I know that there's going to be differing opinions. Regardless of whether you agree with me that AI is an amazing thing and is a tool for us to use, or whether you believe that AI is unethical and we should walk away, make sure that you know what AI is and how it's used, so that way you can be a part of the conversation. Because we need all voices to be heard so that we can drive this new, young technology forward in a way that's legal, in a way that's ethical, and in a way that is making space for all of us. So that's it. No AI talk would be complete without showing you the images that were generated and then the prompts. Some of them I thought were pretty good, and some of them I left kind of half-baked, so hopefully you were able to spot some of these. All right, I think that's it. So, any questions? We got 5 minutes left.
I'll just hold. So you mentioned WoW using some generative AI, and I assume that's based on the artwork artists have made for them and such. What do you think about the right to not have your art being used in that, even if you've made that art for a company? Because let's say an artist makes some art for a company and then stops working at the company, they do not benefit from a different artists having it easier to do their job. They probably wouldn't get compensated by the company unless that was later added to the contract or something.
Absolutely. Yep. From a legal perspective, most of the time the contracts that we sign are very clear-cut. Once we've made something for the company, it is the company's right to do whatever they want. It's the same question as maybe with Adobe Firefly, where they've trained all of these images on their stock images, and they have the legal rights to do whatever they want with those stock images. But at the time, the people who gave their data to those stock images potentially didn't know that this was a possible use case. Yeah, it's a problem space that I can't answer for everybody, but for myself, I think if at this point you know that this technology exists and you don't agree with it, then you need to start writing stuff into the contract about that. For those who were unable to write the contract about it, I think it's tough luck.
I guess on that note, since we're in Europe, we luckily do have some moral rights that we cannot sign away no matter what, which in theory would extend to something like this, because it's how can your artwork be used in the future. So if you don't specifically sign it away, you theoretically would have some legal ground, in Europe at least. US not as much.
Yeah, I know, trust Europe to have morals. I kind of think that another counterpoint to that could potentially be, how is that different than if you have somebody who creates the art style and then they leave and you have another like junior artist come in and mimic that style? That's perfectly legal. That's perfectly ethical. So I lean towards probably okay, but again, I'm very biased.
One last on that. Since you mentioned the stock images being opt-out, I believe, what do you think about the ethics of having it be opt-out instead of opt-in?
As long as it is very clear that, like, it's not hidden away in some of those like long scrolling texts of these are your privacy rights, I think it's fine either way. But I do think it needs to be clear.
Thanks.
Yeah.
when making a game with AI, what's a good method of getting data without wasting too much time? Because game development takes a lot of time.
What kind of data are you looking to generate?
Probably movements to check out the maps.
Oh, specifically for that? I can send you the link for the paper that's in here, but most of what they do is published, so you could just take a look at how they're getting that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you expand on what you feel about mood boards? Because that was a surprise to me.
Oh. So for me, mood boards are something that never make it to production. So in this case, if you have a favorite artist, my favorite artist is Ramon Hurtado. Is it okay for me to go and make a mood board where I say, I want a futuristic city set in Norway, and I want it to be in the style of Ramon Hurtado? In that case, it's art style mimicry, which feels really unethical to me. But it's also something that never makes it to production. It's something that I'm just using for me to inspire. And that's pretty commonly used. You do that in a Google search. So that's where there's that dilemma for me, is you're potentially using an artist name, you're potentially doing something that feels very unethical. But
So it's more about using the artist's name. If you do that, then it's then I get it.
If you just go and you're like, I want a cool world, what do you think? Totally fine, go for it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I've seen a new, I don't know if it was an AI or if it was something else, but I saw a thing where you could poison your image so that it looks exactly the same, but do an AI, a generative AI training on that. It would ruin the generative kind of result. So I'm wondering, do you think it's kind of ethical for artists to poison their images for AI? Or if they should be more transparent about saying, hey, don't train this, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that article come out too. I don't know about that. I haven't given that one consideration. I guess my gut feeling is as long as all it's doing is corrupting its own image and not corrupting the rest of the model, then I think perfectly ethical. But if you're then corrupting the rest of the model, I don't know. That feels bad to me. Yeah. But again, these are just my takes. They're not legal takes or anything. So you guys are welcome to your own opinions.
A bit away from the generative and GANs and so on. You mentioned testing automation. Do you know if there's any good resources on where to get started with that? Since a lot of what I've seen in the past is very theoretical, not that it's very difficult to implement, kind of.
I think it's probably still very difficult to implement because most of what I've seen has come from EAC, which is the Applied Research Division. But all of what they're doing is is posted and is published. So that I think that would be the best place to start with that.
Okay, back to generative.
All right.
What do you think about Steam banning AI or banning something generated with an AI model that you don't have a clear ownership of all the source images for?
I think it's a little short-sighted because we are seeing things like GitHub Copilot, where how can you even tell how much of that was generated? And there's also the question of once it's generated, how much do you have to put your own flair on top of it before it becomes your own? That's been the legal case that I've seen where people are like, well, if like company X goes and generates a whole bunch of stuff, then it's the IP, the property is now free. Well, potentially, but not if they then adapt it in some way, right? So, yeah.
Well, if it's in terms of the copyright not being able to copyright the content, then technically only the changes they make are copyrighted. But also, it wouldn't go back. The IP itself wouldn't be free. It's just the specific images they generated.
But it does come down to that question of like how much like does it then become yours versus
Okay, last question. So you mentioned upscaling of textures, and I remember somewhat recently, I don't remember how recent it is, a YouTube channel named, what's it called? Something Corridor. The VFX artists have been, what was it? Corridor Crew, yeah. They've done a lot of cool VFX work in the past, and recently they did a video where they tried to like beautify or make upscaled versions of games and such, but a lot of them ended up sort of beautifying, kind of applying a beauty filter to some of the characters. What do you think about that?
Like, is that ethical?
Yeah.
Or
what do you think about, I guess, beauty standards being kind of encoded into the models?
as long as they're not biased, I think it's fine. I think that's an interesting use case. But you do, at that point, have to start worrying about bias. An interesting example of bias was that if you, I don't know if it's been fixed, but if you search for an image of a fireman, it's almost always going to be a white male. So you have to watch out for things like that. Or we had the delightful speaker yesterday talking about bias. I think those are things in beauty standards that we would need to make sure you're not displaying any discrimination in that. And it looks like we are at time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. Such a great talk. I'm sorry, dude. All right, folks, it's almost over. I'm about to let Sylvia come up and wrap up this year's Konsoll. But before I go, I just want to say it's been such an honor being your host. We've been through so much together. We've laughed together. We cried together. We were in pain together. And we learned so much, especially about fire routines and stuff. It was great. I was probably going to say something else, but yeah, I'm rapidly forgetting what I was about to say. Oh yeah, thank you all for coming here just to see me host. I thought that was great. Thank you for that. I hope I met your expectations. That was cool, and yeah, you're cool people. Good, and you've been such a good audience. Good job being a good audience. I don't know where you learned it, but I mean, they did a good job teaching you, whoever it was. You're welcome. It's like, thank you. I have practiced. Yeah, I think that's it. Is that it? Thank you. Oh, and also thank you, Sylvia, for trusting me to do this. I mean, that's reckless.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Konsoll 2023. I hope you've all had a good time. This event has been wonderful for us, and we hope it has been just as wonderful for you. So in this climate, celebrating and elevating the contributions of everyone, it's imperative. And we're so proud this year that we're one of the very few game developer conferences in the world to have a gender-balanced speaker list. So we're getting, I'd like to cheer for that, but yeah. So we're getting to the end of the event now, and I'd like to take this opportunity to give some thanks. I'd like to give a big thank you to our speakers for making their way here to share their knowledge and experiences with us. And it's been so wonderful to have so many speakers coming from both abroad and locally to meet our Norwegian industry. Yeah. So many people have helped to make this conference happen, but I'd like to give a special thank you to the fantastic team who've been working hard from all corners of the world to bring you Konsoll. So if I can invite as many of them to up on stage to join me as I can, I'd like to please thank Katrina, Aslak, Alexandra, Robin, Husam, Jane Emily, Vivian, Frederick, Simon, Kjersti, Sophia, Jørn, and our amazing game master, Usan. Thank you so, so very much. We also want to thank our fantastic volunteer team of red shirts, Mia, Charlie, Njol, Ayla, Sigurd, Ruben, Maria, Torstein, and Maria. The stream this year was made possible by our sponsors Bakom Film and Know It, and we'd like to thank our streaming team who've worked hard to bring these talks to those at home. Thank you so much to Sofia, Santiago, Marix, Eugenia, Lauris, and Peter, and to our stream producers, Sharsti, Simon, and Robin. I'd also like to give a big thank you to our venue, Grieghallen, and our Grieghallen technicians, who you might not have seen, who did a fantastic job behind the curtains. Ivana, Kariana, Theodore, Anniken, Frode, and Henrik. Okay, and to give a big thank you to our sponsors this year, without whom we wouldn't be here. We have Bergen kommune, NFI, Mediefondet Sefir, Vestland fylkeskommune, Funcom, DirtyBit, Against, Rain Games, Christiania, Know It, Top of Mind, Bakom, Gain, and Nonida. Thank you so much. We hope you'll be leaving refreshed and excited to continue forging your own career path, and we wish you a safe journey home, and we hope to see you back again next year. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.